Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm still trying to process it all. I've told very few people because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest. And maybe someone here has experienced something similar. It was summer 2021, and Manitoba was experiencing one of the worst wildfire seasons I can remember. I've been a volunteer firefighter for 8 years now. Nothing fancy, just doing my part for the community. That summer, they needed all hands on deck. The drought had turned the forests into tinderboxes, and fires were popping up faster than we could contain them. I was assigned to a crew working about 60 miles north of Winnipeg with 3 other volunteers. Martin, who I'd worked with before, plus Dana and Kevin, who were from a neighboring district. We'd been battling a particularly stubborn fire for 3 days straight, working 12-hour shifts that felt like 20. The fire had already consumed over 8,000 acres and was threatening to jump a creek bed that served as a natural fire break. On that day, July 26th, the wind had picked up, pushing the fire our way faster than predicted. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe even with our masks. My eyes stung constantly. The heat was unbearable, like standing too close to a bonfire, except there was nowhere to step back to. We were coated in sweat, ash, and dirt. My muscles ached from hauling equipment through rough terrain for days. Around 4 in the afternoon, Martin and I were working along the eastern edge of the creek bed. Dana and Kevin had taken the western side. Our job was to clear any potential fuel and wet down the area to prevent the fire from jumping across. The creek itself was barely a trickle due to the drought, just another sign of how bad things had gotten. The smoke was getting thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards at best. That orange-gray haze that firefighters know all too well. We were working methodically, our backs to the creek, facing the approaching fire. Every few minutes, embers would float down around us, and we'd have to stamp them out before they could ignite anything. I was focused on my work when Martin grabbed my arm. "Hard!" "Mike, look," he said, his voice muffled through his mask, but clearly alarmed. I looked up, annoyed at first. We didn't have time to waste, but then I saw what had caught his attention. Through the smoky haze about 40 yards ahead, 3 large figures were emerging from the tree line. My first thought was that other firefighters had gotten trapped on the wrong side of the fire line, but within seconds, I realized these weren't people. At least not people as I understand them. The first figure was massive. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over what I would estimate as human height. It had to be over 8 feet tall. It moved with these powerful ground-eating strides through the underbrush. Its body was covered in dark brown-black hair, not like a costume, but like an animal's natural coat. Long arms swung at its sides, hands that looked too large for even its massive frame. Right behind it was a second figure, slightly smaller, but still imposingly large. Maybe 7 feet tall. This one was carrying something against its chest, cradled in its arms. It took me a moment to realize it was carrying what appeared to be a baby or a young one. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Martin and I just stood there, our tools forgotten in our hands, as these creatures emerged into a small clearing where the smoke had temporarily thinned. For a brief moment, maybe 15 seconds, though it felt much longer, I could see them clearly. The largest one, which I assumed was the male, had this broad, flat face with a pronounced brow ridge. Its eyes were deep-set, dark, and unmistakably intelligent. The nose was wide and flat. It didn't look like a man in a suit or like an ape exactly. It looked like something in between, something uniquely its own species. The second one, the female I guess, had a slightly narrower face with lighter colored hair around her cheeks and what I'd call her chest area. The baby in her arms was smaller than a human infant would be relative to its mother's size, with much less hair, almost hairless, with dark glossy skin. Its eyes were wide open, looking around with what seemed like fear. They were about 30 yards from us when the male suddenly stopped. It turned its head directly toward us, and I swear to God our eyes met. There was recognition there, not just animal awareness, but understanding. It made a low sound, not quite a grunt, but deeper, more resonant. The female stopped too, clutching the baby tighter. The male moved in front of them, positioning himself between his family and us. He raised one arm slightly, palm out, in what looked like a protective gesture, not threatening us, just shielding them. We were all frozen like that for a few seconds, me and Martin standing there with our jaws probably on the floor, and this family, because that's what they were, a family, assessing us while the forest burned around us all. Then the male turned his head slightly, looking back toward the approaching fire. I could see the orange glow reflecting in his eyes. He made another sound, this one more urgent, directed at the female. And then, with 3 long, smooth strides, they were moving again. The female went first with the baby, and the male followed, looking back at us one more time before they disappeared into the smoke on the other side of the clearing. The whole encounter might have lasted 45 seconds. It wasn't until they were gone that I realized I'd been holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. "Did you?" Martin started to say, his voice shaking. "Yeah," I said. "I saw them." We stood there for another minute, just staring at the spot where they'd vanished. Then our radios crackled with Kevin asking about our progress, and reality came crashing back. The fire was still coming. We still had a job to do. We worked through the rest of our shift in a daze. We tried to focus on the fire, but every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the woods where we'd seen the creatures. The image of that male standing protectively in front of his family kept flashing in my mind. That night, back at base camp, Martin and I sat apart from the others. We were exhausted, filthy, and still processing what we'd seen. After picking at our food in silence for a while, Martin finally spoke. "We should tell Dana and Kevin," he said quietly. I nodded. Part of me wanted to keep it between us, knowing how crazy it would sound. But these were our teammates, and if there were creatures like that out there, they deserved to know. We called them over to our table, away from the other crews. Their faces grew increasingly bewildered as we described what we'd seen. Kevin kept looking around like he thought we were playing some elaborate prank. Dana just listened, her eyes getting wider. "Sasquatch," she said when we finished. "You're describing Sasquatch." The word hung in the air between us. I'd deliberately avoided using it. It carried too many associations with hoaxes and blurry photos. But hearing Dana say it somehow made the experience more real, gave it a context. "I don't know what they were," I said honestly. But they were real. They were intelligent, and they were fleeing from the fire, just like any human family would. Kevin was skeptical, understandably. He asked all the questions you'd expect. Was it just smoke playing tricks on our eyes? Could it have been other firefighters or evacuees? Was the stress and exhaustion getting to us? But Martin and I were certain. We described details that couldn't be explained away. The infant's eyes, the specific way the male had moved to protect his family, the proportions of their bodies that were similar to humans but distinctly different. "We should report this," Kevin finally said, though he didn't sound convinced himself. Dana shook her head. "To who? And say what? That we saw Bigfoot running from a forest fire? We'd be laughed out of the service." She was right, of course. We all knew it. This wasn't something we could put in an official report. Even if someone believed us, what good would it do? These creatures, this family, was just trying to survive, just like every other animal fleeing the fire. We agreed to keep it between the 4 of us, at least for the time being. The next morning we were back fighting the fire, which eventually came under control after another 3 days of hard work. We never saw the creatures again, though I kept looking, hoping for another glimpse to confirm I hadn't imagined it all. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about them every day. I wonder if they made it to safety, if that baby is growing up somewhere deep in the forests of Manitoba. I wonder how many of them are out there, living alongside us without our knowledge. I've gone back to that area twice since then, in my free time, just hiking, looking. I haven't seen anything, but sometimes when I'm deep in the woods, I get this feeling of being watched, not in a threatening way, just observed. The experience changed me. I used to see the forest as something to be managed, protected from fire, but ultimately just a resource. Now I understand it's home to things we don't fully understand. Intelligence doesn't belong only to humans. Family doesn't belong only to humans. These creatures, whatever they were protecting their own, just like we would. I still don't know what to call what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some undiscovered primate species. All I know is that they were real. They were smart. And they were a family trying to survive, just like us. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone told me this story, but I know what I saw. Martin knows what he saw. And somewhere in the forests of Manitoba, that family is out there. I just hope they're safe. Story 2, : It was Thanksgiving night, and I'd spent the day at my daughter Amy's apartment in Cleveland. She'd moved there about 6 months earlier for a teaching job, and since it was her first holiday in her own place, she was determined to host. My husband couldn't make it. He was recovering from knee surgery and didn't feel up to the drive, so it was just me making the hour-and-a-half trip up from Atlanta. The day had gone well. Amy's turkey was a bit dry, though I'd never tell her that. But she'd really outdone herself with the sides. We'd had a nice relaxing day, watching the parade in the morning and football in the afternoon. I didn't drink much, just a single glass of wine with dinner. I've never been much of a drinker, and I knew I had to drive home that night. Amy had tried to convince me to stay over, but I had to get back to check on my husband and give him his medication. Plus, I had our dog waiting at home who needed to be let out. So around 9:30, I hugged my daughter goodbye and started the drive back. It was pitch black on Highway 75. November in Georgia can get properly dark, especially once you're out of the city lights. The highway wasn't busy at all. Everyone was probably still in food comas at their families' houses. I remember feeling thankful for the lack of traffic. Driving at night isn't my favorite thing. I had the radio on low, some station playing early Christmas music already. I was about 40 minutes into my drive, in a pretty rural stretch between Cleveland and Dahlonega. There weren't many streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the darkness, trees lining both sides of the highway. That's when I first saw it. At first I thought it was a man crossing the road. You know how your brain tries to make sense of things? Well, mine immediately went to drunk guys stumbling across the highway after Thanksgiving dinner. I slowed down, not wanting to hit someone, even though they had no business crossing a highway at night. But as my headlights fully caught the figure, I realized something was off, very off. This wasn't a person. It wasn't wearing clothes, for one thing. The entire body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but with this weird sort of hunched posture, shoulders rolled forward, and the arms, God, the arms were all wrong. They hung down much lower than a person's would, almost to the knees. The hands at the end of those arms were huge. I'd hit the brakes pretty hard by this point, slowing almost to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. Thank goodness there was no one behind me. The thing moved quickly across the road in these sort of smooth strides that covered a lot of ground. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen, maybe 7 feet. It's hard to judge height from a car, especially at night, but it towered over the guardrail at the side of the road. As it reached the other side, it did something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It stopped, and then it turned and looked at me. I was maybe 30 feet away at this point, my headlights illuminating it clearly. I could see its profile as it turned its head. Not fully facing me, but enough that I could make out the shape of its face. It wasn't a bear's snout, which was my brain's next desperate attempt to make sense of what I was seeing. It was flatter, more like an ape's face, but bigger, wider, not like any ape I've seen in zoos or on nature shows. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds. I couldn't see the color of its eyes in the darkness, just that they reflected my headlights slightly, like a deer's or cat's might, but not as bright. There was intelligence in those eyes. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. This wasn't just some animal crossing the road. It was looking at me, assessing me. Then, without any warning, it turned away and stepped off the shoulder of the road. There was a pretty steep embankment there, maybe 15 or 20 feet down into dense woods, but this thing didn't carefully pick its way down. It just sort of dropped out of sight, like it was taking a single giant step down. There was barely a sound. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My heart was pounding in my ears. I must have sat there frozen for a full minute before I came to my senses enough to realize I was stopped in the middle of a highway at night. I forced myself to drive on, going way under the speed limit, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the sides of the road. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. Had it been a bear? No, absolutely not. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. They don't walk upright for that distance, and they don't have that body shape. A person in a costume, out here, on Thanksgiving night, miles from anywhere, and no costume could give someone those proportions, that fluid movement. By the time I got home, I was shaking. My husband took one look at me and thought I'd been in an accident. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. He was concerned, asked if I was feeling okay, suggested maybe I was more tired than I realized. I let him think that, because the alternative, that I'd actually seen what I thought I'd seen, seemed too impossible. But I knew what I saw. The next morning, I called the local animal control. I didn't tell them what I really thought I'd seen. I just reported a large bear crossing Highway 75. I was worried about people's livestock, or that someone might hit it with their car. The woman on the phone took my report politely enough, but I could tell she didn't think much of it. They get bear reports all the time in North Georgia. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind. I'd always been a skeptic about Bigfoot and all that. I'd roll my eyes at those TV shows where they go crashing through the woods at night with their cameras. But after what I saw, I couldn't dismiss it anymore. I started researching, quietly at first. I didn't want people thinking I was losing it. I found out there had been other sightings in the North Georgia mountains over the years. Nothing recent that I could find near Highway 75, but enough in the general region to make me feel less alone. About a month after it happened, I worked up the courage to drive back to that spot in the daylight. I parked on the shoulder, probably where that thing had stood when it looked at me. The embankment was even steeper than I remembered, dropping down into thick woods. I didn't go down there. I'm not that brave, and my knees aren't what they used to be. But standing there, I tried to imagine how something that large could disappear so quickly and quietly down that slope. Something else struck me that day. There were houses and farms not too far from this spot, but they were hidden behind the trees. Whatever I saw could have been moving between patches of forest, using the cover of night to cross the more exposed areas. It made me wonder how many times it had done this before, how many other people might have glimpsed it and, like me, been too afraid of ridicule to speak up. I've only told a few people the full story over the years. My husband knows now. It took me almost a year to convince him I wasn't joking or confused. My daughter still thinks I saw a bear, and my eyes played tricks on me in the darkness. A couple of close friends know, and my sister, though she's convinced I need to see a neurologist. The thing is, I know what I saw wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either. It moved with purpose, with awareness. When it looked at me, There was recognition there, not of me personally, but recognition that I was another thinking being. That's what haunts me the most. I'm 68 now, and I've never seen anything like it again, though I find myself scanning the roadsides whenever I drive that stretch of highway. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the woods at night, occasionally crossing roads when it thinks no one is watching. Before that night, I would have bet money that Bigfoot was just a myth, a story made up by attention seekers or people who mistook bears for something more exotic. Now I don't know what to believe. I just know what I saw, and no amount of rational explanation has ever been able to convince me otherwise. That Thanksgiving night changed something fundamental in how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. I've made my peace with the fact that I'll probably never have answers about what exactly crossed my path that night. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still see those eyes looking back at me from the darkness, and I wonder if it tells stories about the human it saw on the road that night. The one who sat frozen in her car with her mouth hanging open, too shocked to even scream. Story 3. I never really talk about this. Maybe because I still have a hard time wrapping my head around what I saw that day in the summer of '78. I was 9 years old then, living with my parents in rural Montana, a place where our closest neighbors were a 15-minute drive away. I'm 45 now, but I can still see it clear as day in my mind. Our house sat on about 20 acres, with the main building on a slight rise. From the upper deck, you could see all the way down to our lower field, which butted up against dense woods that stretched for miles. Dad kept a couple horses in that field, and we had this amazing dog, a lab shepherd mix named Ranger. That dog wasn't afraid of anything. I'd seen him chase off bears, stand his ground against mountain lions. He was fearless. That particular day in late July was scorching hot. Mom and Dad had gone into town for supplies, leaving me at home with strict instructions not to wander off. I wasn't worried. Ranger was always by my side, my protector. I remember sitting out on that upper deck, drinking Kool-Aid and flipping through a comic book while Ranger lounged beside me, occasionally lifting his head to scan the property like he always did. It was around 3 in the afternoon when everything changed. I noticed Ranger suddenly sit up straight, his ears perked forward, his whole body tense. At first I thought maybe a deer had wandered into the field. That happened pretty often. But then Ranger did something I'd never seen before. He started growling, low and deep in his throat. The hair on his back stood straight up. "What is it, boy?" I asked, setting down my comic. He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on something down in the lower field. Then, without warning, he bolted, just took off racing down the hill toward whatever he'd spotted. That's when I noticed our horses. They were running too, not toward whatever Ranger was charging at, but away from it, heading straight for their barn in a full-blown panic. I stood up, shielding my eyes from the sun, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when I saw it. Near the tree line at the far edge of our property, there was something massive moving across the field. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear? No, it was walking upright, running actually, with these long, powerful strides. The way it moved was nothing like a bear rearing up. This thing was built for running on 2 legs. I remember being frozen in place, just watching as this creature moved with this strange, fluid grace despite its size. And it was big, so much bigger than my dad, who was 6'2". This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It had this enormous chest and shoulders that seemed to roll as it moved, covered in dark brown or maybe black hair, not fur exactly, more like hair that hung and moved with each stride. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell its head was different from a human's, like it sat directly on those massive shoulders without much of a neck. Its arms were long, swinging as it ran, and I remember thinking they seemed to hang down past its knees. Ranger was charging straight toward this thing, barking like crazy now, but he was still only halfway across the field. The creature didn't seem to notice him at first. It was just running, parallel to the tree line. I don't know what possessed me, but suddenly I screamed, not words, just a terrified yell. That's when it stopped, just froze mid-stride, and then it turned its head toward the house, toward me. I'll never forget that moment, the feeling of those eyes finding me. Even from that distance, I could feel it looking at me. My entire body went cold. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, we just stared at each other. Then, Ranger's barking got closer, and the thing suddenly changed direction, veering sharply toward the woods. It crossed the remaining distance in what seemed like just a few massive strides and disappeared into the trees. The whole encounter probably lasted less than a minute, but it's burned into my memory. I remember running inside, locking the door, and then realizing Ranger was still out there. I could hear him barking at the edge of the woods. I was crying, screaming for him to come back, too terrified to go out and get him. He came back eventually, about 20 minutes later. He was panting hard, but didn't seem hurt, just keyed up, pacing around the house and going to the windows to look out, growling occasionally. When my parents got home about an hour later, I was a mess. I tried explaining what I'd seen, tripping over my words. Dad immediately grabbed his shotgun and, to my horror, said we needed to go check it out. Mom wanted to call the sheriff, but Dad insisted we look first, probably thinking I'd just seen a bear or maybe a neighbor trespassing. I begged to stay in the house, but Dad said I needed to show him exactly where I'd seen the man. That's what he kept calling it, though I kept saying it wasn't a man. Mom stayed behind with the phone ready to call for help if needed, while Dad and I, followed by Ranger, headed down to the field. Ranger was acting strange, still alert, but also hesitant, which was so unlike him. When we got to the spot where I'd seen the creature disappear into the trees, Dad found some broken branches and what looked like large depressions in the ground. Not clear footprints, the ground was too hard from the summer heat, but areas where the grass had been flattened by something heavy. Could have been a moose, Dad said, but I could tell he didn't believe that. Moose don't run on two legs. The strangest part was the smell. There was this musky, sour odor hanging in the air near the tree line, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. Dad noticed it too. I saw his nose wrinkle up. Ranger was sniffing frantically, whining a little, but wouldn't go into the woods even when Dad tried to encourage him. That scared me more than anything. Ranger never backed down from anything. Dad stood there for a long time, just staring into the trees, his shotgun ready. Finally, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Let's get back to the house, son." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I heard things outside, branches breaking, heavy footsteps. I swear at one point I heard a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before or since. A deep, rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite human. When I told my parents the next morning, they said it was probably just an owl or maybe a cougar, but they exchanged this look I couldn't interpret at the time. It wasn't until years later, when I was about 16, that my parents finally opened up about other things they'd experienced on our property, like they'd been protecting me from knowing all this time. They told me about incidents at our swimming spot down by the creek, about half a mile from our house. Several times they'd been enjoying a peaceful afternoon when something would start crashing through the vegetation on the opposite bank. Something big that they never saw clearly, just movement and breaking branches. It was always aggressive enough that they'd immediately pack up and leave. Dad told me about hunting trips where he'd felt watched, about finding broken trees snapped at heights no normal person could reach. Mom talked about nights when she'd woken up to the sound of wood knocking against wood from the forest. 3 distinct knocks, always in the same pattern, sometimes answered by similar knocks from farther away. Most disturbing was hearing about Ranger's behavior that I'd never noticed. Apparently, There were multiple occasions where he'd stand at the edge of our yard, staring into the woods, completely focused on something none of us could see. Dad said he'd try to get Ranger to go investigate, but the dog would just plant himself firmly and refuse to move forward, while also refusing to retreat, like he was standing guard. This from a dog who would chase anything, anywhere, without hesitation. The weird thing is, these incidents seem to come in waves. We'd have a period of strange occurrences. The sounds, the feeling of being watched, the horses getting spooked for no reason, and then months of nothing unusual. Like whatever it was, would move through the area, and then continue on somewhere else, maybe in some kind of seasonal pattern. I never saw the creature as clearly as I did that summer day when I was 9. But there were other glimpses over the years. A dark shape moving between trees at dusk, unusually large shadows at the forest edge, once even what looked like eyes reflecting our porch light from the tree line. Eyes set too high up to be any normal animal. We never reported any of this officially. In rural Montana in the 70s and 80s, you didn't go around talking about seeing Bigfoot unless you wanted to become the town joke. Dad was respected in the community, had a good job at the lumber mill, and wasn't about to risk his reputation, so it remained our family secret. I moved away for college and never moved back, though my parents stayed in that house until they passed. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I've always chosen to live in cities ever since, always surrounded by people, concrete, streetlights. I tell myself it's about career opportunities, but deep down, I know it's because I never want to look out a window and see those eyes looking back at me again. Sometimes I try to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear, and my child's imagination filled in the rest. Maybe it was a person in some kind of costume, though that doesn't explain the size or the way it moved. The logical explanations all fall apart when I really think about the details that have stayed crystal clear for over 36 years. I've read about Sasquatch encounters since then, of course. Some match elements of what I saw, others don't. I'm not here to convince anybody of anything. I just know what I saw that day in the summer of '78. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that shared the wilderness around our home, that maybe still does. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still wonder if it's out there, moving through someone else's woods, being glimpsed by some other terrified kid who will carry that moment with them forever. Story 4. I still get nervous thinking about it, even though it's been 18 years. Just typing this makes my hands shake a bit. I've never told this story publicly before. Most of my friends think I'm making it up, and my wife just says I saw some bears. But I know what I saw that day in October 2006, and it wasn't bears. I work as an environmental technician in New Jersey. My job involves collecting soil and water samples from different sites, mostly abandoned industrial areas and old mines, to check for contamination. Back then, I was assigned to an area in Sussex County, near Stoke State Forest. It's beautiful country, but incredibly remote in spots. That particular day in mid-October, I was doing routine sampling at an old mining area that had been closed for decades. The autumn colors were peaking, and it was one of those perfect fall days. Crisp air, blue sky, temperature in the 50s. I remember being in a good mood despite being out there alone. I had my truck, a white Ford F-150 the company provided, loaded with my equipment, sample containers, a field testing kit, GPS unit, and maps. The thing about these abandoned mining areas is how isolated they are. The service road I had to take wound through dense forest for about 40 minutes from the main highway. It was barely maintained, rutted, overgrown in spots with branches scraping the sides of my truck. No cell service, of course. The company had given me a satellite phone for emergencies, but I kept it off to save battery. I finished my sampling around 4 in the afternoon. I remember checking my watch and thinking I'd be out before dark if I left right away. The sun sets early in October, and those woods get pitch black fast. I packed up my gear, logged my GPS coordinates, and started heading back down the service road. About 15 minutes into my drive back, I noticed two deer, a doe and what looked like a yearling, sprinting through the trees uphill from the road. They were running flat out, white tails up, clearly spooked by something. I slowed the truck down, thinking maybe there was a bear in the area. We have black bears in Sussex County, and I didn't want to come around a bend and find one in the middle of the road. That's when I saw something at the base of the hill, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, or maybe a large animal lying down. It was light tan in color, almost blending with the fallen leaves. I stopped the truck completely and squinted to get a better look. I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I tapped my horn lightly. Just a quick beep. What happened next made my blood run cold. The log stood up. Not like a bear rearing on its hind legs, but like a person standing from a crouching position. Except this was no person. It was at least 7 feet tall, with proportions all wrong for a human. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its upper body was incredibly wide. The color was a light tan, slightly darker than the deer I'd just seen fleeing. I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. I wasn't even breathing. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it took one step backward. I remember thinking, it's going to run away. And I almost felt relieved, but instead it did something I still can't explain. It brought its hands together and made a short clapping motion, not like applause, but more like it was signaling something. Then it dropped to one knee and moved forward using both its arms and legs, in a fluid motion I've never seen any animal make. It disappeared into what I had always assumed was just an old mine air shaft in the hillside. I knew about these shafts from my job. They were ventilation for the underground mines, usually just narrow vertical tunnels. But this one must have been different, because what I saw enter it was no small creature. I was about to start the truck and get the hell out of there when movement caught my eye again. A second creature came running across the slope. This one was moving upright, faster than the first one, and was slightly taller, maybe 7.5 feet. It was darker in color too, more of a reddish brown. It didn't even look in my direction, just ran straight to the same hole, knelt down, and disappeared inside. Both creatures had the same basic features: long arms, sloped shoulders, and thick bodies covered in short fur. Not shaggy like you see in the movies or drawings, but flat-lying fur, almost like a deer's coat. Their movement was what struck me most: natural, strong, and quick. Nothing about how they moved seemed awkward or costume-like. They moved like athletes, powerful and coordinated. I sat there in my truck, unable to move. My mind kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe they were guys in ghillie suits, but no human moves like that. Bears? Definitely not. The way they stood upright, the proportions of their bodies, the deliberate hand signal, none of it matched any animal I knew. After about a minute of sitting there paralyzed, I finally came to my senses. I put the truck in reverse and backed down the road for about 100 yards before finding a wide enough spot to turn around. I didn't want to take my eyes off that hillside. The whole time, I kept expecting one of them to come charging out at me. The drive back to the highway was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I was being followed. My heart was racing so hard, I could feel it in my throat. When I finally reached cell service, I pulled over and just sat there, trying to calm down enough to drive safely. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? I had no photos, no evidence, just my word that I'd seen two creatures that matched descriptions of Sasquatch or Bigfoot entering what looked like an old mine shaft. Even to my own ears, it sounded crazy. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep well. I kept seeing those creatures in my dreams, especially that strange clapping motion the first one made. It seemed so deliberate, so intelligent, like it was communicating. About 3 weeks after the incident, I had to return to the same area for follow-up sampling. I almost called in sick, but I knew I'd eventually have to go back. This time, I brought a camera and a co-worker. making up some excuse about needing help with the equipment. When we reached the spot where I'd seen the creatures, I nearly drove past it before realizing something was different. The air shaft had been sealed with concrete, and new fencing had been installed around the area. There was no signage, no indication of who had done the work or why. My coworker didn't think anything of it. Old mines get sealed up all the time for safety reasons, but the timing seemed too coincidental to me. I casually asked my supervisor about it when I got back to the office. He just shrugged and said it wasn't in our work orders, must have been another department, or the mining company fulfilling some long overdue obligation. Over the years, I've researched similar sightings in the area. There have been a few reports of tall, bipedal creatures in Stoke State Forest and the surrounding areas, but nothing as specific as what I saw. I've gone down rabbit holes online reading about Sasquatch living in cave systems or abandoned human structures, but most of it seems far-fetched even to me, who actually saw something. What keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of those creatures, but the questions. Why were they using that mine shaft? How deep did it go? Were there more of them down there? And most disturbing of all, who sealed up that shaft so quickly afterward, and did they know what was using it? I still work in environmental assessment, though I've moved to a different region now. Every time I'm in a remote area, I find myself scanning the tree line, listening for unusual sounds. I've never seen anything like those creatures again, and part of me hopes I never will, but another part of me wishes I had proof. Something concrete to validate what I know I saw that day. Those weren't bears, they weren't men in suits, and they weren't figments of my imagination. They were something else entirely, something that moved with purpose and intelligence, something that communicated and used human structures, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was right there in front of me. I don't know what to call them except Sasquatch, and I don't know why they were there or where they went. All I know is what I saw that day in October changed how I look at the world and made me question what else might be out there, hiding just beyond our notice. Story 5, Mama. I've been a hunter all my life. My dad taught me how to track, shoot, and respect the wilderness when I was just a kid. By the time I was 30, I thought I'd seen everything the woods had to offer. I was dead wrong. This happened back in November of 2013. I had planned a solo hunting trip in the Caney Mountain Conservation Area in southern Missouri. I've hunted those woods dozens of times before. It's full of hills, oak and pine forests, and usually plenty of deer. I'd taken a few days off work and was looking forward to some quiet time in nature. Just me, my gear, and hopefully a nice buck to bring home. I parked my truck at one of the remote access points early in the morning. The air was crisp, maybe in the high 30s, with that particular November smell of decaying leaves and pine. I remember checking my pack one last time. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water purifier, rifle, ammo, the usual stuff. I locked the truck and headed out, planning to hike several miles in before setting up camp. The first day was completely normal. I hiked along a high ridge that gave me good views of the surrounding area. I spotted some promising deer trails and rubs, making mental notes for where to hunt the next morning. By late afternoon, I found a perfect spot to make camp, a small clearing overlooking a wide valley with a good water source nearby and plenty of firewood. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and built a small fire as the sun was setting. I heated up some chili I'd brought along and just sat there enjoying the silence. Well, not complete silence. There were the usual woodland sounds, some coyotes yipping in the distance, an owl hooting nearby. Nothing out of the ordinary. I turned in around 9, crawling into my sleeping bag and falling asleep almost instantly. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch said, a little after midnight. What I do know is what woke me. A sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started as a low, rumbling roar that built in intensity until it seemed to fill the entire valley. The best way I can describe it is like a cross between a lion's roar and a whale's call, but even that doesn't capture it. It was deep, powerful, and deliberate. That's the word that came to mind. Not like an animal reacting to something, but like a message being sent. The roar came from across the ridge, maybe half a mile away. I sat up in my tent, heart pounding, trying to place it. Nothing in these woods makes a sound like that. Not coyotes, not bobcats, not even black bears. As I was processing this, a second roar answered the first. This one closer, and then a third. From somewhere in the hollow behind my tent, I grabbed my rifle and crawled out of the tent. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the immediate area around my camp, but the trees created deep shadows everywhere else. I stood there for what felt like forever, scanning the darkness, my rifle ready. But I couldn't see anything moving. The roars continued on and off for the next few hours. Sometimes they seemed to move farther away, then they'd come closer again. I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. Finally, as dawn approached, the sounds stopped. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I packed up camp. I'd planned to stay 2 more days, but something felt very wrong. I didn't want to take the same trail out that I'd come in on. It would mean crossing that ridge where I'd heard the first roars. Instead, I decided to follow an east slope trail that would eventually loop back to my truck. It was longer, but seemed safer somehow. The trail wound through some thick brush and rocky terrain before descending into a ravine. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours, constantly looking over my shoulder, when I heard it again. That same deep, powerful roar, but this time much closer, maybe 200 yards uphill from me. Almost immediately after, I heard something moving through the trees parallel to the trail I was on. Something big, really big. Breaking branches, displacing rocks, whatever it was keeping pace with me exactly. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. This wasn't coincidence. I was being followed. I picked up my pace, half jogging down the trail. The thing in the woods matched my speed perfectly. Another roar came, so close now that I could feel it in my chest. It wasn't just loud, it was physically powerful, like standing next to a subwoofer. I raised my rifle, scanning the tree line, but still couldn't see what was following me, and then I did. Up on the ridge above the trail, maybe 75 yards away, something moved out from behind a cluster of pines. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was walking on 2 legs, but it wasn't human, not even close. It was covered in dark, rough hair, not fur exactly, but hair. It moved with an incredible fluid grace despite its massive size. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. What really got me were the eyes, dark, set deep under a prominent brow ridge. They were looking right at me, intelligent, calculating. Its mouth was slightly open, showing teeth, and its chest was heaving with each breath. The arms were long, too long, hanging down past where knees would be on a human. It roared again, right there in plain sight. The sound hit me like a physical force. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. In that moment I had a clear shot. My rifle was up, safety off, but I didn't fire. Something stopped me. Fear, maybe. Or some deeper instinct telling me that shooting would make things much, much worse. Instead, I turned and ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran as fast as I could down that trail, slipping on rocks, crashing through brush. For the next 2 miles, I kept hearing it behind me. Not constant pursuit, but enough movement to know it was still there, still following. The trail eventually curved back toward the access point where I'd left my truck. The last stretch ran through a narrow wash between 2 hills, a natural funnel. As I entered this passage, the footsteps behind me got closer, heavier, faster. I was gasping for breath, legs burning, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. When I finally broke out of the trees and saw my truck sitting there, I nearly cried with relief. I fumbled with my keys, threw my pack and rifle inside, and started the engine. As I pulled away, spinning wheels on the gravel road, I looked in my rearview mirror. It was standing at the edge of the forest, just watching, not approaching, not retreating, standing perfectly still as I drove away. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. I've replayed that day in my mind thousands of times since then. What stands out to me is how that creature moved, exclusively on two legs, with remarkable speed and control over rough terrain. It deliberately made its presence known, while staying mostly hidden until that moment on the ridge. The way it matched my pace exactly, stopping when I stopped. It was toying with me, herding me. The physical details are burned into my memory. The rough, dark hair covering its body. Those impossibly long arms, the wide chest and powerful shoulders, the flat face with that broad mouth and those deep-set eyes that held something, not animal wildness, something else, but it's the roars that still wake me up at night sometimes. They carried a physical force I could feel in my body, not just sound, but something more primal, a warning, a statement of dominance. I never fired my rifle because somehow I sensed it wasn't directly threatening me. It could have caught me easily if it wanted to. Instead, it was demonstrating its presence and power, escorting me out of its territory with deliberate intimidation, but without direct aggression. Before this happened, I'd always laughed at Sasquatch stories, thought they were campfire tales or misidentifications. Now, I'm absolutely certain about what I saw that day. There's something out there in those woods that science hasn't classified. Something intelligent that knows how to stay hidden. I've been back to Caney Mountain since then, but never alone, and never overnight. Sometimes when I'm there, I get the feeling I'm being watched. Maybe I am. Maybe that thing remembers me. One thing's for sure, I'll never forget it, and I'll never again assume I know everything about what lives in our forests. Story 6. I've wrestled with whether to share this for almost 20 years now. I'm not the type to make up stories for attention, and honestly, part of me still doesn't want to believe what happened that night back in November of 2003. I was 42 then, living alone in what I thought was my dream situation. A cozy apartment above a detached garage on a property overlooking the Salmon River in Welch's, Oregon, right on the edge of Mount Hood National Forest. The location was absolutely gorgeous, but extremely isolated, especially during winter when all the vacation homeowners cleared out. My landlords owned the main house, but only used it during summer months. Come fall, they'd head back to Portland, and I'd basically have the whole property to myself. At the time, I thought it was perfect. I worked from home as a freelance editor, so the quiet suited me. Plus, the rent was cheap, since I kind of served as a caretaker during the off-season. The apartment itself was simple but comfortable. One bedroom, a small kitchen, living area, and a bathroom. The front door opened onto a wooden deck that wrapped around one side of the building with stairs leading down to the gravel driveway. From my deck, I could see nothing but forest and the river glimmering through the trees. At night, without the light pollution, the stars were incredible. But November 18th, 2003 changed everything for me. It had been a perfectly normal Tuesday. I remember working on editing a manuscript about Oregon's hiking trails, which now seems grimly ironic. The weather had turned nasty around mid-afternoon, one of those raw, wet days where the temperature hovers just above freezing and the wind drives the rain sideways. By 5 o'clock, it was already pitch dark outside. I had my blinds down, heater cranked up, and was feeling cozy despite the storm rattling the windows. Around 6 that evening, I had just heated up some leftover soup and sat down at my little dining table when I heard it. A tremendous bang against my front door. Not a knock, not someone's fist. This was like someone had taken a battering ram to it. The entire door shuddered in its frame, and a picture fell off the wall nearby. My first thought was that a tree branch had broken off and hit the building, but then it happened again. Bang! Even harder this time. The door actually bowed inward slightly from the impact. I remember my soup spilling across the table as I jumped up. Hello? I called out, instantly regretting making any noise. Who's there? No response except the wind. My heart was racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. I crept toward the door, staying off to the side in case whatever was out there decided to break it down. I checked the deadbolt, thankfully locked, and peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anything but darkness. My outside light had either burned out or been broken. My phone was back on the kitchen counter, so I edged my way there, never taking my eyes off the door. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice seemed surreal against my panic. Someone's trying to break into my apartment, I whispered. I'm alone, and I'm scared. I gave her my address, and she assured me officers would be dispatched. But she also told me what I already knew. Given my remote location, it would take time for them to reach me. The closest sheriff's station was in Sandy, at least 30 minutes away in good weather, and with the storm it could be longer. Stay on the line with me, she said. Find a secure room if you can. I took my phone and a kitchen knife and retreated to my bedroom, closing and locking that door too. I sat on the floor beside my bed, where I couldn't be seen from either window. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the knife down before I accidentally cut myself. For maybe 15 minutes, there was nothing but silence from outside. The operator kept checking in, asking if I heard anything. I was just starting to wonder if maybe it had been a fallen branch after all when I heard it, a deep, guttural grunting sound from the direction of my deck. Not human. Definitely not human. There's something out there, I whispered into the phone. I can hear it. What does it sound like? The operator asked. Like an animal, but not one I recognize. It's making these grunting noises. It might be a bear, she suggested. We do get black bears in that area sometimes. A bear made sense. They occasionally came around looking for food, especially before hibernation. But something about those sounds didn't fit. They were too deliberate somehow. The grunting stopped, and then I heard heavy footsteps moving across my deck. Slow, measured steps. The wood creaked under significant weight. Whatever it was big. It's walking around my deck, I told the operator. How much longer until the police get here? They're on their way, she assured me. Stay hidden and stay quiet. I sat frozen in my bedroom for what felt like hours, but was probably only another 30 minutes. The footsteps would stop, then start again, circling the apartment. Occasionally, I'd hear that grunting sound or a deep rumbling noise that was almost like breathing, but more purposeful. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom window. My bedroom was on the side of the apartment, with a window that looked out onto the part of the deck that wrapped around from the front. I had blinds down, but they were the cheap plastic kind with slats that didn't close completely. Something compelled me to look. I know that's what people always criticize in horror movies. Why would you look? But there's this powerful human instinct to know what's threatening you. So I crawled across the floor, still clutching my phone, and raised myself just enough to peer through a gap in the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. Two large, dark eyes were staring directly at me through the glass. Not a bear's eyes. These were set forward in what I could just make out as a face covered in thick, dark fur. The face was high up. I realized whatever this was stood much taller than me, and I'm 5'8". It wasn't moving, just watching. I dropped back to the floor, pressing myself against the wall under the window. There's something looking in my window, I whispered to the operator. It's not a bear. It has a face almost like... I don't know how to describe it. Ms. Morgan, stay calm, the operator said. The officers are about 15 minutes out, but I couldn't stay calm because whatever was outside my window knew I was there. It had seen me, and now it was tapping on the glass, not the violent banging from before, but deliberate rhythmic taps with what sounded like claws or very hard fingernails. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath. terrified it would break the window. But the tapping stopped after a minute, and I heard those heavy footsteps retreat back toward the front of the apartment. Against my better judgment, I crawled back to the window and peeked out again. I caught a glimpse of a large, dark silhouette moving away, upright, not on all fours like a bear. It had broad shoulders and long arms, and moved with an oddly fluid grace for something so big. Then it turned and looked back at my window. We made eye contact again, and this time I couldn't look away. Those eyes held me frozen, dark and intelligent, with none of the wildness you'd expect from an animal. They blinked once, slowly, deliberately, while maintaining eye contact with me. I felt like it was communicating something, though I couldn't tell you what. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, it turned away and disappeared around the front of the building. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, a total of nearly 3 hours after my initial call. By then, whatever had been on my deck was long gone. The officers searched the property with flashlights but found nothing. No footprints in the mud, no fur caught on the railings, no evidence at all. Could have been a bear, one officer suggested, just like the 911 operator had. Or maybe a bobcat, though they don't usually get that aggressive. I tried to explain what I'd seen, the eyes, the size, the way it walked upright, but I could tell they thought I was just a city woman spooked by wildlife. They took my statement and promised to have patrols drive by more frequently, but I could see in their faces they weren't taking it seriously. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't sleep. I put additional locks on my doors and windows. I bought motion sensor lights for the entire perimeter of the garage. I even considered getting a gun, though I'd never fired one in my life. Eventually, I worked up the courage to talk to some of the year-round locals at the general store in Welch's. Without directly saying what I'd seen, I asked if they'd ever experienced anything strange in the woods around here. The older man who ran the store got quiet. "The mountain has its secrets," he finally said. "Most folks who live here long enough have stories they don't share with outsiders." One elderly woman who overheard our conversation later approached me in the parking lot. "Was it watching you?" she asked without preamble. I nodded, unsure what to say. "Consider yourself lucky," she said. "Most people who see them that close don't get to just walk away. They're curious about us, but they don't like being seen." "What are they?" I asked. She shook her head. "Different tribes have different names, but they've been here longer than we have." I moved out 3 months later, breaking my lease and forfeiting my security deposit. I couldn't stand the isolation anymore, the feeling of being watched whenever I went outside. I've lived in the city ever since. To this day, I have no concrete explanation for what visited me that night. When the subject of Bigfoot or Sasquatch comes up in conversation, I stay quiet because what I saw doesn't match the popular image. It was more deliberate, more intelligent in its actions than a simple forest creature. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my door hadn't been locked that night. Would it have come in? Was it just curious about the human living alone in its territory, or did it have more sinister intentions? I don't know the answers, but I do know that when I dream about those eyes blinking slowly as they stared into mine, I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I narrowly escaped something that most people don't even believe exists. Story 7. I've debated for years about sharing this. Even typing it out now, my hands are getting clammy. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or goes looking for them. I'm just a regular guy who saw something I still can't explain, and it's been eating at me for almost 25 years. It happened in September of 1999. I was working second shift at the factory outside Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'd been at that job for about 3 years by then. The pay was decent, and it let me afford the little place I was renting about 20 minutes out of town. The drive home was usually peaceful. Just me, the radio playing softly, and the dark country roads. I knew every curve, every pothole, every spot where deer might jump out. That night was clear but moonless, making it darker than usual. It was around 11:30 when I clocked out. I remember because I'd been hoping to get off a little early to catch the end of the baseball game, but our supervisor had us finish a rush order. I was tired, but not exhausted, just ready to get home, grab a beer, and crash. I took my usual route home, which included this winding back road that crosses over Mud Creek. It's not much, just a narrow 2-lane road with no streetlights, cornfields on one side and woods on the other. There's this one particular stretch that has several blind curves, so I always slow down there. Too many close calls with deer over the years had taught me to be cautious. As I approached one of these curves, doing maybe 30 miles per hour, my headlights swept across something standing by the fence that ran alongside one of the cornfields. At first glance, I thought it was a burned tree stump. We'd had some lightning strikes earlier that summer that had hit a few trees in the area, but as I got closer, still moving slowly, I realized this was no tree stump. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. The thing was standing upright, leaning slightly forward with both arms, not branches, arms, resting on the top rail of the fence. It was just standing there as if contemplating the cornfield or maybe listening for something. My headlights hit it full on for what must have been 5 or 6 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me by at least 1.5 feet, so 7.5 feet tall, minimum. Its shoulders were massive, far wider than any human I've ever seen. The arms were long, hanging down with the hands, paws, I don't know what to call them, resting casually on the fence. Its chest was thick, barrel-like, but the body didn't look fat or bulky, just solid, powerful muscle. I'd guess it weighed somewhere between 300 to 350 pounds, but it's hard to be precise in the dark. The whole body was covered in grey hair, not fur exactly, more like hair that hung in patches of different lengths. The chest seemed to have less hair, almost bare in spots, but it's the head I remember most vividly. It was large, proportionally bigger than a human head, with a face that reminded me of a bulldog, wide, heavy cheeks that drooped slightly. There wasn't much hair on the face, which made the features more visible in my headlights. The eyes were deep-set and dark, and this is the part that still makes my skin crawl, they tracked my car as I approached. It was aware of me, completely aware. Just before I reached the curve where it was standing, it turned its head to look directly at me. There was this moment, just a split second, where our eyes met. I felt a jolt of something primal run through me. Not exactly fear, not yet, but a deep, instinctual recognition that I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that didn't fit into my understanding of the world. Then it moved. God, the way it moved. It turned away from the fence and ran into the cornfield toward the tree line about 50 yards away. It ran upright, on 2 legs, with a stride that ate up ground faster than any human could manage. What struck me was how silent it was. No crashing, no rustling corn that I could hear through my closed windows. Just smooth, purposeful movement, like it knew exactly where it was going. By the time I crossed the bridge over Mud Creek just a few hundred feet further down the road, I had goosebumps so intense they were painful. My arms were covered in them, and the hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. I didn't slow down again until I reached my driveway, and even then, I sat in my car with the engine running for a good 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. I remember going inside and double-checking all the locks on my doors and windows, something I'd never bothered with before in that quiet rural area. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, a baseball bat beside me, waiting for dawn. Every noise outside made me jump. The refrigerator cycling on nearly gave me a heart attack around 3 in the morning. The next day, I seriously considered calling in sick. The thought of driving back along that same road in the evening made my stomach turn. But I also knew I'd sound crazy if I tried to explain why. Sorry, boss. Can't come in because I saw Bigfoot last night, wasn't going to fly. So I went to work, white-knuckling the steering wheel the entire way there. That evening, I took a different route home, one that added 15 minutes to my commute but avoided that particular stretch of road. I did that for weeks afterward. When I finally worked up the courage to drive past that spot again, it was in broad daylight on a weekend. I even pulled over and walked to the fence, looking for, I don't know what, footprints, hair, some evidence that would prove to me I hadn't imagined the whole thing. There was nothing, of course, just a normal fence alongside a harvested cornfield. For years, I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I'd always been practical, level-headed. I fixed cars on the weekends for extra cash. I played softball with a league in town. I wasn't the type to see monsters in the dark or make up stories for attention. In fact, the fear of ridicule kept me silent for so long that it became easier to just push the memory down, to try and convince myself it had been a bear standing oddly, or some hunter in a weird get-up. But I knew better. Bears don't stand 7.5 feet tall on their hind legs and casually lean on fences. Hunters don't have shoulders that wide or move that silently through cornfields. It wasn't until around 2005 that I finally looked up information about Bigfoot sightings. I was at the library using their computer, didn't have internet at home yet, and I made sure no one could see my screen. What I found shook me all over again. There were accounts from all over Pennsylvania, some just a county over from where my encounter happened, describing creatures that matched what I'd seen. The height, the build, the way it moved, it all lined up. One account in particular, from 1997 in the next county over, described a creature with that same bulldog-like face and drooping cheeks. Reading that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just in my head. Other people had seen it too. Over the years, I've occasionally driven past that spot, always in daylight, always with a knot in my stomach. The landscape has changed somewhat. The fence was replaced with a taller one around 2007, and new houses have gone up about a quarter mile down the road. I wonder if the people living there have seen anything, if they've heard strange noises at night or felt watched while working in their yards. I moved away from Bloomsburg in 2010 for a better job opportunity, but I still have family in the area. When I visit, I deliberately avoid that road at night. My brother once asked why I always take the long way around to his place. I just told him I like the scenery better. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what I saw. It's the intelligence behind those eyes. There was something cognizant there, something that recognized me as surely as I recognized it as being outside the natural order. It wasn't just some animal. It was evaluating me, making decisions, thinking. I'm still not sure why I'm sharing this now. Maybe it's because enough time has passed that the raw fear has dulled. Maybe it's because I'm tired of carrying this alone. Or maybe it's because I need someone, anyone, to tell me they believe me, that I'm not crazy, that what I saw that September night in 1999 was real. All I know for certain is that I saw something impossible leaning on a fence outside Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes, when I'm driving on dark country roads and my headlights sweep across the tree line, I find myself scanning the shadows, both dreading and somehow hoping to catch another glimpse of it. Proof that I didn't imagine the whole thing. But mostly I just keep driving. Story 8. I've been hesitant to share this for years. Most people would think I'm crazy, and honestly I wouldn't blame them. But I need to tell someone who might understand what happened to us in those mountains. Carol and I were so in love back then. We dated for 3 years before I finally proposed, and we couldn't wait to start our lives together. We weren't rich by any means. I worked as a forestry technician, and she was finishing her nursing degree. But we'd saved enough for a small wedding and a week-long honeymoon at this beautiful secluded cabin in the Cascades. It was the perfect spot, surrounded by old-growth forest with a small lake nearby. The rental was cheap because it was October, past the main tourist season, and we were thrilled to have the wilderness practically to ourselves. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked during the day, cooked dinner together, made love by the fireplace. We even brought our dog Rex along. a big German Shepherd mix who loved the outdoors as much as we did. I remember thinking life couldn't get any better than this. Everything changed on our third morning. I woke up early, around 6:30, to let Rex out. Carol was still sleeping, and I wanted to surprise her with breakfast. I stepped onto the porch, took in that crisp mountain air, and noticed something was off. Rex was standing stiff-legged at the bottom of the steps, his fur raised along his spine, staring at our car parked about 20 yards from the cabin. When I walked over to him, I saw what had him so alert. There were handprints on all the windows of our Honda Civic. Not normal handprints. These were huge, at least twice the size of my hand, and they looked like they'd been made with some reddish-brown substance. My first thought was that some local kids had played a prank on us with paint or mud, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The substance looked like dried blood. I called Rex to my side and approached the car cautiously. The prints were on every window, even the back windshield. They weren't random smears. They were deliberate hand impressions with what looked like 5 fingers splayed out. Some of them had dragged downward, leaving streaks. Whatever had made them had to have been at least 7 feet tall to reach the center of the roof like that. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door, and woke Carol. She thought I was exaggerating until I showed her through the window. We debated what to do. The cabin had no landline, and our cell phones had no service. We decided to drive into town to report it, about 30 miles away. We were packing up some essentials when a police cruiser pulled into our driveway. 2 officers stepped out, an older guy named Ramirez, who looked like he'd been working these mountains for decades, and a younger officer named Ellis. They explained that a man who lived about 5 miles down the road had reported his dog killed by something the previous night, and they were checking on all the rentals in the area. When I showed them our car, Officer Ramirez's expression changed. He didn't seem surprised exactly, but more like he'd seen this before. He asked us how long we'd been at the cabin and if we'd noticed anything unusual. We told him everything had been normal until that morning. "What do you think did this?" I remember asking him. "A bear." Ramirez shook his head. "Bears don't leave handprints, and they don't typically kill without eating their prey. Johnson's dog was just torn apart, left there." The younger officer was taking photos of our car while Ramirez suggested we spend the night in town. "Just as a precaution," he said. "We've had reports of an unusually large animal in these parts. Could be a wolf, could be something else. Best not to take chances." I should have listened. God, why didn't I listen? But I was stubborn. We'd paid good money for this honeymoon, and I didn't want to let some prankster or wild animal ruin it. I assured the officers we'd be careful and promised to call the station if we noticed anything else strange. Ramirez gave me his card and told us they'd increased patrols in the area. They helped us clean the car. The substance did turn out to be blood, which made my skin crawl. And then they left. Carol wanted to go, but I convinced her to stay. "We've got Rex," I told her. "He'll warn us if anything comes around. Plus, I've got my hunting rifle." That night, we locked all the doors and windows. I kept my rifle leaning against the wall near our bed. We tried to enjoy ourselves, made dinner, watched a movie on the small TV in the cabin, but there was this tension in the air. Every sound from outside made us jump. I kept reassuring Carol everything was fine, but I wasn't so sure myself. We went to bed around 11. I remember checking the time because I wanted to make sure we were up early enough to go into town the next day for supplies. I'd finally agreed with Carol that we should cut our trip short and leave in 2 days instead of 4. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Rex was barking frantically. Not his normal bark, but this high-pitched, almost panicked sound I'd never heard him make before. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. Carol grabbed my arm. "John, what's that smell?" There was this overwhelming stench coming in through the vents, like rotting meat mixed with something musky and wild. I grabbed my rifle and turned on the bedside lamp. Rex was at the window, barking non-stop, his entire body rigid. "Stay here," I told Carol. I pulled on my jeans and boots. "Don't go out there," she pleaded, but I was already heading for the door. I thought maybe a bear or mountain lion was trying to get into our trash or something. I was going to fire a warning shot to scare it off. When I stepped onto the porch, the smell hit me like a wall. Rex pushed past me, still barking, and ran to the side of the cabin. I called for him to come back, but he disappeared around the corner. I heard him bark a few more times, then nothing. "Rex!" I called out, sweeping the area with my flashlight. The beam caught something on the ground, large barefoot-like prints in the dirt leading into the trees. They were at least 18 inches long. My hands started shaking. I called for Rex again, but the forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just dead silence. I was about to go after him when I heard this sound from the tree line, like wood cracking, but deeper, more deliberate. My flashlight beam caught movement about 50 yards away, something large shifting between the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but whatever it was stood much taller than a man. I raised my rifle, but before I could do anything, I heard police sirens in the distance. The shape in the trees moved back, disappearing into the darkness. I stood frozen on the porch until the police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. It was Ramirez and Ellis again. They'd gotten a call from another cabin about strange noises and had decided to check on us too. I told them about Rex and showed them the footprints. Ellis stayed with Carol while Ramirez and I searched for Rex with flashlights, calling his name. We couldn't find him anywhere. What we did find was disturbing. On the side of the cabin were these long gouges in the wood siding, like something with massive claws had scraped against it. They were at least 7 feet up the wall. "We need to get you folks out of here," Ramirez said quietly. "Now." He wouldn't tell me exactly what he thought was out there, but the look on his face was enough. We packed our essential belongings in less than 10 minutes. The whole time, that putrid smell lingered around the cabin. Ellis mentioned it was the same odor they'd encountered at the scene of the killed dog. As we were about to leave, Ramirez pulled me aside. "Listen, I've worked these mountains for 23 years. There are things in these forests that don't match any official wildlife reports, things that local tribes have stories about going back centuries." "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying some things are better left alone. Get back to civilization and don't come back to these parts." We followed the police cruiser for about 5 miles down the mountain road. I was devastated about Rex and kept watching the rearview mirror, hoping somehow he'd appear. Carol was silent beside me, clutching her jacket around herself, even though the car heater was on full blast. And then, like some miracle, my headlights caught something on the side of the road ahead. Rex walking along the shoulder, head down. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car, calling his name. He looked up and ran to me, whimpering and pressing against my legs. I checked him over with my flashlight. No injuries, but his fur was matted with mud and pine needles, and he smelled like that same awful odor that had permeated the cabin. The police had stopped too, and Ramirez came back to check on us. He seemed genuinely surprised to see Rex unharmed. "You're lucky," was all he said. "Now get going." We drove straight home that night, 5 hours on dark highways with Rex trembling in the back seat. He wouldn't settle down, kept whining and looking out the windows. Carol fell asleep eventually, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. After that night, something changed in me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in those woods. I started researching similar incidents, joining online forums about unexplained wilderness encounters. I found stories from all over the Pacific Northwest. Hikers finding massive footprints, campers hearing strange vocalizations, pets going missing. I went back to work, but I was distracted. I started taking weekend trips to those mountains, setting up trail cameras, looking for evidence. Carol tried to understand at first, but as weeks turned into months, she grew frustrated. We fought constantly. She said I was obsessed, that I was throwing away our marriage for some wild goose chase. She was right, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know what was out there. Rex would never go into the woods with me again. He'd bark frantically whenever I'd packed my gear. Sometimes I'd come home from work and find him standing at the window, staring into our backyard, growling at nothing. A year after our honeymoon, Carol filed for divorce. I didn't fight it. 2 months later, I quit my job and moved to a small cabin near the Canadian border. I told myself it was temporary, just until I found what I was looking for. That was 8 years ago. I've been living in these mountains ever since, moving from place to place. Sometimes I work seasonal jobs to make enough for supplies. Most nights I sit by my window with my rifle across my lap, listening. They're out there. I hear them moving around my cabin when the moon is new. I find those same massive footprints in the mud. Sometimes I catch glimpses, tall, dark shapes moving between trees, but they're smart. They know I'm watching. People have stopped looking for me. My parents think I died in these mountains years ago. Maybe in some ways I did. The man who married Carol doesn't exist anymore. The worst part is the nights when I hear them calling to each other. It's not animal, not human, something in between. A language of deep whoops and howls that echo through the valleys. Sometimes it sounds almost like they're saying my name. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking, but I'm not crazy. I'm just the only one still looking for the truth, and someday I'll find it, or they'll find me. Either way, this ends in these mountains. Story 9. I've been putting off writing this for months because I know how it sounds. I was always the person who'd roll my eyes when anyone mentioned Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'd laugh along with everyone else about those blurry photos and obviously fake footprints. But something happened last summer that I still can't explain, and I need to get it off my chest. I work at a small school in Whitmore, California, nestled in the hills of Shasta County. It's a beautiful area, but remote. Every day I commute from Redding up through these winding mountain roads. My 11-month-old son, Milo, comes with me to the daycare at the school. It's not ideal, but as a single mom, I don't have many options. That morning started like any other. It was early August, and the whole area was thick with smoke from the Delta and car fires. The news had been warning they might merge, and everyone was on edge. The air had this eerie orange glow, and ash was falling like snow. I remember thinking how apocalyptic everything looked as I strapped Milo into his car seat. "We'll be quick today, buddy," I told him, checking his little face in the rearview mirror. He was half asleep, clutching his stuffed elephant. The drive from Redding to Whitmore takes about 40 minutes on a good day. You have to take this old logging road up the mountain for part of it. No guardrails, barely wide enough for 2 cars in most places. The smoke made visibility even worse that day, maybe 50 feet ahead at most. I was driving slower than usual, gripping the steering wheel tight, squinting through the haze. I had the radio on low, some morning talk show discussing evacuation routes, and Milo was babbling to himself in the back seat. About halfway up the mountain, I came to this sharp hairpin turn that always makes me nervous. As I carefully navigated around it, that's when I saw it. About 300 feet ahead of me, near where Tintagel Lane intersects with the logging road, something stepped out from the tree line. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge, I mean impossibly tall. My Honda CR-V suddenly felt tiny, like a toy car. This thing crossed the entire width of the road in just 2 strides. 2. The road there is easily 20 feet across. It was completely covered in dark brown hair, but I could see patches of grey, especially around its upper back and shoulders. It moved with this fluid, purposeful motion. Not lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that size to move, just smooth, deliberate steps. The strangest part was how it didn't even acknowledge me, didn't turn its head, didn't pause, nothing. Just crossed the road and disappeared into the dense trees on the other side. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds. I hit the brakes and just sat there, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I remember looking in the rearview mirror at Milo, who was still happily playing with his toy, completely oblivious. For a second, I wondered if the smoke was making me hallucinate. I rolled down my window, letting in the acrid smell of burning forest, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But I knew what I'd seen. I just couldn't admit it to myself yet. I don't know how long I sat there, probably only a minute or two, though it felt like hours. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, go back to Reading, call in sick. But then Milo started fussing, and somehow that snapped me back to reality. I had responsibilities. I couldn't just sit on a mountain road all day. I drove the rest of the way to school with my doors locked, constantly checking my mirrors. Every shadow in the trees looked threatening. Every branch moved by the wind became a massive arm reaching for my car. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs, but I've seen bears before. This wasn't that. When I finally pulled into the school parking lot, I was a mess. My shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the AC being on full blast. I sat there for a minute, trying to compose myself before getting Milo out of the car. I didn't want to scare him with my panic. I remember walking into the building and feeling like I was in a daze. My colleague Sarah took one look at me and immediately asked what was wrong. I mumbled something about the smoke making me feel sick, then hurried to drop Milo off at daycare. All morning, I couldn't focus on my work. I kept replaying those 5 seconds in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. During my prep period, I found myself Googling Bigfoot sightings Shasta County on my phone, hunched over my desk like I was looking at something shameful. I was shocked by how many results came up, dozens of sightings in the area over the years, pictures of strange footprints, audio recordings of weird howls and knocks. I'd lived in Reading for 3 years and had never heard any of this. How had I missed it? At lunch, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I was sitting with 3 other teachers, Sarah, Mark, and Deb, all people I'd known for years. I trusted them. "If I tell you guys something crazy, will you promise not to laugh?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They must have seen something in my face, because they all nodded seriously. "I think I saw something on my drive up here today," I said, staring at my untouched sandwich. "Something that shouldn't exist." I told them everything, the crossing, the height, the grey patches in the brown hair, how quickly it moved. I expected skepticism, maybe even concern for my mental health. What I didn't expect was the way they all exchanged looks. "You're not the first," Mark finally said. He'd been teaching at Whitmore for over 20 years. "There's a reason some of us carpool up here." Sarah nodded. 2 winters ago, I was driving home after dark when something knocked on my car roof. I was going about 30 miles an hour. Deb hadn't seen anything herself, but she told me about the strange howls she'd heard while camping with her husband near Whiskey Creek. "Nothing makes sounds like that," she said. "Not coyotes, not wolves, nothing." It turned out nearly half the staff had experienced something strange in these mountains. Unexplained sounds, glimpses of large figures, or just that unmistakable feeling of being watched. Nobody talked about it much because, well, who wants to be known as the crazy person who believes in Bigfoot? As the day went on, I started to feel less crazy but more frightened. If this thing was real, and I was becoming increasingly convinced it was, then it was out there while I drove these roads every day with my baby. When school ended, I asked Mark if he would follow me down the mountain in his truck. He agreed without hesitation, and I could tell he understood my fear without me having to explain it. The drive home was uneventful but tense. Every curve in the road made my stomach clench. I kept my eyes moving constantly between the road ahead and Milo in my mirror. Mark stayed close behind me the whole way, and I've never been so grateful for someone's presence. That night, after putting Milo to bed, I sat up for hours researching. I learned about the long history of sightings in the Pacific Northwest, the Patterson-Gimlin film, the countless Native American legends about wild men of the woods. I found forums where people shared their encounters, many remarkably similar to mine. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd seen was real. But with that certainty came more questions. How could something so large exist without definitive proof? How many of them were out there? Were they dangerous? The answers I found online varied wildly, from peaceful forest guardians to aggressive territorial predators. I barely slept that night. Every creak in my apartment made me freeze. I kept getting up to check on Milo, irrationally afraid that something might have broken in to take him. I knew I was being paranoid, but after what I'd seen, the world suddenly seemed full of possibilities I'd never considered before. The next morning, I called the school and asked if I could work remotely for a few days, claiming smoke inhalation concerns. They agreed, and I spent the rest of the week in Reading, jumping at shadows and questioning my sanity. When I finally had to return to in-person teaching, I joined a carpool with 2 other teachers who lived in Reading. Safety in numbers, right? We never saw anything on our drives together, but sometimes, in certain stretches of road, we'd all fall silent at the same time, scanning the trees. It's been 3 months now, and I still haven't seen anything else. Sometimes I almost convince myself it never happened. Maybe it was a trick of light through the smoke. Maybe I was more sleep-deprived than I realized with an infant at home, but then I remember the fluid way it moved, the absolute certainty I felt in that moment, the validation from my colleagues who had their own stories. I've changed since that day. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I don't hike alone anymore. I keep Milo closer, and I've stopped dismissing people's strange experiences. Because now I know that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones most desperately told in earnest. I don't know what I saw on that smoky mountain road last summer. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I don't. But I do know that there are things in these forests that defy explanation, things that move just at the edge of our understanding, and once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. That's my story. Believe it or don't. I almost wish I didn't believe it myself. Story 10. I've been hesitating to share this for months, but I need to tell someone who might understand what my son and I experienced last November. My family has owned this hunting property for generations, about 80 acres that borders a massive deer lease in East Texas. There's a wet slough area at the back of the property that stays soggy most of the year. It's dense, remote, and honestly, I've always felt uneasy there. My 13-year-old son Mason and I were in our deer stand on November 11th. I remember the date because it was Veterans Day weekend. We'd gotten there around 3 in the afternoon, hoping to catch something before sunset. Mason had just gotten serious about hunting, and I was excited to share this with him. The weather was perfect, around 55 degrees with a light breeze, and we'd been sitting quietly for maybe 40 minutes. That's when we heard it. The sound of a pig being attacked violently somewhere in the woods to our east. If you've never heard a pig being killed, it's not something you forget. This wasn't a clean kill either. This was frantic, desperate squealing that made the hair on my arms stand up. Mason grabbed my arm so tight I had bruises the next day. The squealing lasted about 45 seconds before it stopped suddenly, not gradually, like an animal bleeding out, but just stopped mid-squeal. Then nothing. The woods went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence is never a good sign. We sat frozen in our stand for maybe 10 minutes. I was debating whether we should pack up and leave when movement caught my eye at the tree line about 70 yards away. A doe and 2 yearlings emerged from the thicker part of the forest. but something about their behavior was wrong. The doe kept approaching the tree line, then frantically backing up, stomping and snorting. She did this 3 or 4 times, like she was terrified to go back into the woods, but needed to. Eventually, she led her yearlings along the edge of the tree line until they reached a game trail and disappeared. Mason whispered, "Mom, what's wrong with them?" I had no answer. About 7 minutes after the pig went silent, we heard the first knock. It's hard to describe if you haven't heard it yourself, but it was a solid, deliberate sound, like someone taking a baseball bat to a hollow tree. 3 knocks in succession. Knock, knock, knock. I've been hunting these woods since I was younger than Mason, and I've never heard anything like it. Before I could process what was happening, another series of knocks answered from the northwest, then a third set from directly north of us. The sounds were triangulating around our position. Mason was trembling so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. "Someone's out there," he whispered. But I knew it wasn't people. Nobody goes into that slough. It's too wet, too dense, and frankly, most locals avoid it. Something about it just feels off. "We're being watched," Mason said, and I couldn't disagree. The feeling of eyes on us was overwhelming. I've been in the presence of predators before. Had a mountain lion stalk me once years back, but this was different. This felt deliberate, intelligent. I should mention that the week before I disposed of 6 feral boar carcasses in the woods. We have a serious hog problem, and after a successful hunt with my brother, we dragged the smaller ones about 300 yards into the woods and left the larger ones near the property line. When I came back 3 days later to check on them, we usually monitor how quickly scavengers take care of them, the smaller boars were completely gone. Not just eaten, gone. No blood trails, no scattered bones, nothing. The larger ones had been dragged about 30 yards deeper into the woods, which would take substantial strength. Back in the stand with Mason, the sun was starting to get low, and I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. "We should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for his sake. That's when we heard the vocalization. It started as a low, guttural sound that rose into something I can only describe as a warble. It wasn't a howl or a scream. It was almost like speech. But no human or animal I know makes sounds like that. It had patterns, inflections, almost like language, but wrong. The sound seemed to come from the direction where we'd heard the pig being killed. Mason started crying silently, tears streaming down his face. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified too. We climbed down from our stand as quietly as possible, but in my rush, I dropped our thermos, which hit every single rung of the ladder on its way down, making what felt like deafening clangs in the silent woods. We froze at the bottom of the stand, listening. The woods remained dead silent for maybe 30 seconds. Then the knocking started again. Faster this time, and it seemed closer. I grabbed Mason's hand and we speed walked toward the UTV we'd parked about 200 yards away. I didn't run. Something instinctual told me not to show fear, not to act like prey. The entire walk back, I felt something pacing us just inside the tree line. I never saw it directly, just shadows of movement, branches swaying without wind. Mason saw it too. He kept looking over, squeezing my hand tighter each time. When we finally reached the UTV, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before getting the engine started. As we pulled away, I glanced in the side mirror and saw something large move from one tree to another about 50 yards back. We didn't talk much on the ride home. Mason just kept saying, "What was that, Mom? What was that?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound crazy. That night, after Mason went to bed, I sat on our porch, thinking about what happened. And I remembered something from when I was a teenager. We had a calf die unexpectedly, and my dad had dragged it to the back of the property to let nature take its course. He'd tied it to a small tree with 2 lengths of rope to keep coyotes from dragging it away, while he decided if he needed to call the vet out for the rest of the herd. When he went back the next day, the calf was gone. Not just gone. The ropes had been untied, not chewed through, and laid out perfectly straight on the ground, parallel to each other. My dad, a practical man who'd lived his whole life in these woods, came back visibly shaken. He never talked about it again, but he stopped going to the back of the property alone after that. 2 days after our experience in the stand, I mentioned what happened to a co-worker who's an avid hunter. Instead of laughing it off like I expected, he got really serious and asked exactly where our stand was located. When I showed him on a map, he told me he'd found a strange footprint near there while scouting for deer the previous season. He described it as like a human foot, but wider, with only 4 toes. He'd taken a picture, but deleted it because it creeped him out so badly. I haven't told many people about this, but I did ask my older sister if she'd ever experienced anything strange on the property. She got really quiet, then told me about something that happened 23 years ago. She was driving home late one night on the country road that runs along our property line when she saw what she thought was a bear standing by the road. As she got closer, she realized it was standing upright, was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and had reddish-brown hair covering its body. She said it turned to look at her car, and she could see eyes reflecting in her headlights. She floored it and never told anyone because she thought they'd think she was crazy. We went back to the stand about 2 weeks later in daylight to retrieve the rest of our gear. Something had torn apart the small platform we used to store our backpacks, ripping the treated lumber like it was cardboard. There were no claw marks, just splintered wood, like something had grabbed it and pulled. I found something else too. About 30 yards from our stand, halfway up a pine tree, there was a broken branch wedged in a fork, about 9 feet off the ground. It wasn't just a branch that had fallen, it was deliberately placed there, pointing directly toward our stand. We haven't been back to that part of the property since November. Mason refuses to go hunting at all now. Sometimes at night, especially when it's raining, I hear knocking sounds from the woods behind our house. Mason hears it too. I've seen him freeze while doing homework, his head tilting toward the window. I don't know what's out there in our woods. I don't know if it's what people call Bigfoot or something else entirely. But I know it's intelligent, it communicates, and it's been there watching my family for generations. And I know with absolute certainty that we are not at the top of the food chain on our own property. Story 11. I've debated posting this for years. Part of me still can't fully process what happened that day in January 2004. I'm not someone who goes looking for the unexplained or believes every bump in the night is something supernatural. I'm a photographer. I deal in what I can see, capture, and document. But what happened in those woods near Hope, British Columbia, still makes my skin crawl nearly 20 years later. I've always had a thing for abandoned places. There's something about capturing the remnants of human lives, the slow reclamation by nature that tells a powerful story through my lens. That January, I'd heard about some old homesteads about 15 miles down an old logging road outside Hope. Perfect winter shots, I thought. The isolation, the snow, the stark contrast. I'd done my research, packed my gear, and headed out early that morning. The drive was rough. 15 miles might not sound far, but on those old logging roads in winter, it's a different story. My truck handled it okay, but I was definitely glad I'd brought extra supplies just in case. By the time I reached the area, it was around 2 in the afternoon. The temperature display on my dash read -10 Celsius, and the snow was deep, probably 14 inches at least. The sky was that pale winter blue that warns you daylight won't last long. I parked at what seemed like a good spot and loaded up my backpack with my camera gear, my Canon DSLR, a couple of lenses, extra batteries, they drain fast in that cold, some snacks and water. I trudged through the snow to the first homestead I could see, an old cabin that was partially collapsed on one side, with what might have been a barn or workshop nearby. The shooting was good. The light was perfect. That low winter sun casting long shadows across the snow, highlighting the textures of the weathered wood. I was in my element, completely focused on getting the shots. I'd been working for maybe an hour when I first felt it, that sensation of being watched. If you spend any time outdoors, you know the feeling. It's primal, something left over from when we needed to worry about predators. Usually I brush it off, probably just a deer or maybe even a bear, though they should be hibernating, but this felt different, more intense. Still, I kept working. The shots were too good to pass up, and the light was starting to fade. By around 4, the light was definitely going. January days are short up there, and I knew I needed to head back. I packed up my gear and started making my way back to the truck. The snow was deeper than I remembered, coming up past my knees in places, making each step an effort. That's when the feeling of being watched intensified. I remember stopping to catch my breath, looking around at the dense forest that surrounded the clearing where the homestead stood. Nothing but trees and snow. But I couldn't shake that feeling. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere in the woods to my left, maybe 100 yards away. Now sounds carry strangely in snow and cold air. I told myself it was probably further away than it seemed. Maybe a deer or elk moving through. I kept walking, picking up my pace a bit. Then another snap, louder this time, and another. Whatever it was big, and it was moving parallel to me. My heart started beating faster. I told myself to stay calm. Wild animals generally don't want anything to do with humans. But as I continued toward my truck, so did the sounds from the forest. Crashing branches, heavy footfalls in the snow. This wasn't some small animal. And whatever it was keeping pace with me, moving through deep snow and dense forest with an ease that didn't make sense. I started walking faster, no longer stopping to rest despite the effort of plowing through the snow. The sounds kept pace. If anything, they seemed to be getting closer, moving in a slight arc that would intercept my path to the truck. That's when I heard something that sent ice through my veins, a deep, guttural grunt. Not an elk, not a moose, nothing I'd ever heard before. I'd like to say I kept my cool, but that would be a lie. I started half running, half wading through the snow, my camera gear bouncing painfully against my back. My breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air. The truck was still a couple 100 yards away, and every step was a struggle. The sounds to my left grew closer. Maybe 200 feet away now, I could hear rhythmic crunching in the snow, bipedal, 2 feet, not 4, walking upright and fast. Much faster than I could move through the deep snow. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys. I fumbled with them, constantly glancing toward the tree line where the sounds were coming from. As I finally got the door open and threw my gear inside, I heard another one of those grunts. Closer now, much closer. I jumped in, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I flipped on the headlights. That's when I saw it. Not the creature itself, but its effects. About 60 feet away, at the edge of the forest, several young pine trees were shaking violently. Snow cascaded down from their branches in sheets. Something massive was moving there, just out of sight in the gathering darkness. I threw the truck into reverse, spun around, and got the hell out of there. The whole way back down that logging road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something enormous emerge from the trees behind me. Nothing did, but that didn't calm my racing heart. It took me nearly 2 weeks to work up the courage to go back. I told myself I needed to see if there was any evidence, anything to explain what had happened. This time I brought snowshoes, which made moving through the snow much easier. There had been fresh snowfall since my last visit, so any tracks were long covered, but what I found was still disturbing. In the area where I'd seen the trees shaking, numerous saplings, some 6 inches thick, were snapped off, not cut, not chewed by beavers, but snapped clean off at about chest height, like twigs. It would take tremendous strength to do that. When I got back to town, I mentioned my experience to a friend who grew up in the area. His face went serious, and he told me another photographer had a similar experience on the same logging road the previous year. They'd been shooting winter scenes when something started following them through the woods. They never saw it clearly, but they described the same heavy footfalls, the same uncanny ability to move quickly through difficult terrain. The locals had a name for what might live in those woods: Sasquatch.Bigfoot. Before my experience, I'd have laughed at the suggestion. Now I'm not so quick to dismiss it. What else could move bipedally through deep snow with such speed and power? What else could snap trees that thick as if they were nothing? I've gone back to those woods a few times since then, always in summer, always with a group. We've never experienced anything like what happened that January day, but I still won't go back in winter. And I certainly won't go alone. I don't know what followed me through those woods. I never got a clear look at it, but the sounds of those footsteps, the grunts, the snapped trees, they've stayed with me. Sometimes when I'm editing photos late at night, I'll think I hear heavy footsteps outside my window. My rational mind knows it's just the house settling or the wind in the trees, but part of me wonders if whatever was in those woods somehow followed me home. The strangest part? Despite all my fear that day, despite fumbling with my camera gear as I ran, I never once thought to turn around and try to photograph whatever was following me. It's like some primal part of my brain knew that seeing it clearly would make it real in a way I wasn't prepared to handle. I still photograph abandoned places. I still venture into remote areas for the perfect shot. But now I pay attention to that feeling of being watched. And when the hairs stand up on the back of my neck, I don't ignore them, because something was in those woods that day, something that didn't want to be seen, but wanted me to know it was there. And for whatever reason, it let me leave. Story 12. I've been putting this off for weeks now, trying to convince myself that what happened that night was just our imaginations running wild. But I can't stop thinking about it. Maybe writing it all down will help me process it. I don't know. It was August 19th, just a couple weekends ago. Our last Saturday night before senior year started. Me and 4 of my friends decided to hang out at Jake's place out in Glide. His family's got this nice property that backs right up to the forest. There's a fire pit about 50 yards behind their house where we always hang out. Nothing fancy, just some logs arranged in a circle around a stone pit, with a few folding chairs scattered around. That night started off completely normal. Jake's parents were inside watching some movie, so we had the backyard to ourselves. Me, Jake, Tyler, Megan and Amber just chilling around a small fire, playing music off my Bluetooth speaker. The stars were out, weather was perfect, warm but not too hot. One of those perfect summer nights, you know? We were all just talking about the upcoming school year, who had what classes, the usual stuff. I remember Amber was telling us about this road trip her family took to the coast. Nothing weird or unusual, just normal teenage stuff. It must have been around 10:30 when things started getting off. Jake was mid-sentence talking about football tryouts when he suddenly stopped and looked over toward the fence line. The property has this chain-link fence that separates their yard from the forest. It's not super tall, maybe 5 feet. "You guys see that?" Jake asked, and we all turned to look. I didn't see anything at first, just the darkness of the tree line beyond the fence. "See what?" Tyler asked. Jake shook his head. "I thought I saw something move over there." We all stared for a minute, but nothing happened. Tyler made some joke about Jake being paranoid, and we laughed it off. But I noticed Jake kept glancing over there every few seconds. Maybe 10 minutes later, Megan suddenly reached over and turned down the music on my speaker. "What's up?" I asked. "Shh," she said, holding up her hand. "Did you guys hear that?" We all went quiet. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the crackling of the fire. Then I noticed something weird. The normal nighttime sounds had changed. Usually you can hear frogs from the creek that runs through the property, crickets chirping, all that stuff, but suddenly it was like someone had hit mute on all of that. That's when I heard it too. This weird dragging sound, like something heavy moving through the underbrush, followed by a distinct snap of a branch breaking. That was definitely something, Tyler whispered. Jake grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The rest of us did the same, and we all pointed our lights toward the fence line. The beams cut through the darkness, but didn't reach very far into the trees. I couldn't see anything unusual, but that weird silence continued. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. Probably just a deer, Amber said, but she didn't sound convinced. Tyler stood up. I'm gonna check it out. Dude, don't, I said. But he was already walking toward the fence with his flashlight. He got about halfway there when the smell hit us. I'll never forget that smell as long as I live. It was like rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I can't even describe, musty and sour and just wrong. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Oh my God, what is that? Megan gagged, covering her nose with her shirt. Tyler had stopped in his tracks. Holy shit, that's disgusting. And that's when we heard it. This deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard, not a bear, not a cougar, nothing like that. It was lower, more guttural, almost human-like, but not quite. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Tyler's flashlight beam was shaking now. Guys, he started to say. Then all hell broke loose. Something, and I mean something, charged at the fence from the woods. I couldn't see it clearly, just this massive dark shape moving impossibly fast. The fence rattled and shook violently as whatever it was slammed into it. Amber screamed. I think I did too. Tyler dropped his flashlight and sprinted back toward us. For just a split second, my light caught it. I still try to convince myself I didn't see what I saw. But I know what I saw. This tall, broad figure, at least 7 feet tall, covered in thick, dark hair. Its arms were unnaturally long, swinging as it moved. I couldn't make out a face, just a massive silhouette. It hit the fence again, and this time I heard the metal groan under the impact. Then it let out this sound. Not a growl this time, but a roar. I've never heard anything like it. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate in my chest. Part scream, part howl, all terrifying. Run! Jake yelled, and none of us needed to be told twice. We all bolted for the house. I remember dropping my phone as I ran. Megan was ahead of me, Tyler right behind me. I could hear Amber crying as she ran. I was too scared to look back, convinced that thing was going to break through the fence and chase us. We burst through Jake's back door, startling his parents. We were all talking at once, hysterical, trying to explain what happened. Jake's dad grabbed a baseball bat and his mom called the sheriff, but of course by the time they came out to check, whatever it was had disappeared back into the woods. We stayed inside the rest of the night, huddled in Jake's living room with all the lights on. None of us slept. We kept replaying what happened, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was someone playing a prank. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't either of those things. The next morning, in the daylight, Jake's dad went out to investigate. What he found didn't make me feel any better. The fence was dented inward in 2 places, and one section had been partially pulled away from the post. One of the folding chairs, a metal one, had been thrown about 20 feet from the fire pit and was twisted and broken. And right inside the tree line, pressed into the soft dirt, were these footprints. Not bear prints, not deer. Footprints, huge ones, with 5 long toes and a wide heel. Jake's dad measured one, 17 inches long. He took photos and showed them to us. The sheriff came back out and took a report, but you could tell he didn't really believe us. He suggested it might have been a bear, even though the prints clearly weren't bear tracks. It's been a couple weeks now, and none of us have talked much about that night. School started and we're trying to act normal, but things have changed. Jake won't go into his backyard after dark anymore. His parents installed security lights all along the fence line. Tyler tries to joke about it sometimes, but I can tell he's as freaked out as the rest of us. I keep replaying that moment in my head when my flashlight caught that thing. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I've ever seen, and that smell, I swear I can still smell it sometimes, like it's stuck in my nose or something. I've been researching online, trying to find explanations, reading stories from other people who've had similar experiences in the forests around here. There are more than you'd think. Most people around Glide don't talk about this stuff openly. But when I mentioned it to my uncle, without telling him what we saw, he just nodded and said the forests here have always had watchers. I don't know what we encountered that night. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever. All I know is that something massive and intelligent was watching us from those woods, something that didn't want us near its territory and made damn sure we knew it. I'm trying to convince myself to go back to Jake's house, to face this fear. But every time I think about sitting by that fire pit again, I hear that roar in my head. I see those long arms swinging. I smell that horrible sour smell. The worst part is knowing it's still out there, just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. School keeps me busy during the day, but at night when I'm trying to sleep, I can't stop thinking about what happened. I keep my blinds closed now. I don't like looking out into the darkness anymore. I don't know if writing this has helped or just made it worse. All I know is that something is out there in the woods around Glide, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. And now I know what happens when you get too close to its domain. I used to love camping and hiking. Now, I don't think I'll ever look at the forest the same way again. Story 13. I've been a fishing guide in Florida for almost 20 years now. I know these waters like the back of my hand. Every creek, every mangrove patch, every sandbar that appears at low tide. I've seen pretty much everything there is to see out here, or at least I thought I had until May 17th, 2022. That morning started like any other charter. I met my clients at the marina around 5:30 in the morning, a retired commercial pilot named Dave and his brother-in-law Mark, who's some hotshot lawyer from Tampa. Nice guys, both experienced anglers. They were staying at a rental in Crystal River for a week and booked me for a couple of days to find some redfish and snook. The weather was perfect that morning, mid-70s. Light breeze, the sun just starting to come up as we headed out. The tide was going out, which is usually great for fishing along the mangroves. Fish get concentrated in the channels as the water drains off the flats. We'd had decent luck for the first hour or so. Dave caught a nice snook and Mark landed a couple of smaller ones. Around 7, we were drifting along this quiet stretch of shoreline with thick mangroves. I was poling the boat, letting us drift with the outgoing tide, working a section I've fished hundreds of times. I remember checking my watch, thinking we had maybe another hour of good fishing before the tide got too low, when I noticed something moving on a sandy bank about 100 yards ahead of us. At first, I thought it was a feral hog. We get a lot of them rooting around in the mudflats at low tide, looking for crabs and things to eat. But as I watched it, something felt off. The way it moved wasn't right for a hog. Then I thought maybe a black bear. We do get them along the coast sometimes. But this thing was hunched over at the waist, with these long arms swinging side to side. It looked like it was digging or foraging in the wet sand. "You guys see that?" I asked, pointing ahead. Dave already had his eyes on it, shielding them from the sun with his hand. Mark was still focused on his fishing line. I stopped poling and let the boat drift closer. The tide was carrying us right toward whatever this thing was. I've seen plenty of weird stuff in the backcountry. Wild boars swimming between islands, escaped monkeys from the Silver Springs attraction, even a panther once. But this was different. When we got about 40 yards away, Dave suddenly whispered, "Holy shit, that's a Sasquatch." I almost laughed. I mean, come on, a Sasquatch in Florida? But when Mark finally looked up from his fishing and saw it too, his jaw literally dropped. And that's when the thing seemed to sense us. It stood up to its full height, and I felt my stomach drop. This thing was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. But it wasn't just the height. This thing was built like a linebacker on steroids. Its shoulders had to be 4 feet across, with a chest that stuck out about 2 feet, just solid muscle everywhere. It was covered in this reddish-brown hair, maybe 10 inches long, all over its body. The hair on its head was even longer, hanging down around its face like some kind of curtain or mane. When the sunlight hit it, the hair almost looked auburn or copper-colored. The face is what really got me. It wasn't an animal face. It looked almost human, but not. The skin on its face was this deep brown, almost black color. It had a full beard and mustache, which made it look even more human-like. The nose wasn't flat like an ape's, but it wasn't exactly human either. Somewhere in between, wide and strong-looking, it had this prominent brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, but not as extreme as you see in gorillas. I couldn't make out the eye color. They just looked dark from where we were. For about 15 seconds, this thing just stared at us. None of us moved. I wasn't even breathing. My hand was frozen on the push-pole. The only sound was water lapping against the boat. Then it turned and started walking away, not running, just this casual stride along the edge of the mangroves. But after a few steps, it turned back toward us and made this sound I'll never forget. A deep, low grunt that turned into a growl. It wasn't super loud, but in the quiet morning air it carried across the water clear as day. It felt like a warning, like it was telling us to back off. After that, it just walked into the mangroves and disappeared. Just like that. Something that big should have made noise crashing through the brush, but there was nothing. It moved through that tangled mess of mangrove roots and branches like it wasn't even there. For what felt like minutes, none of us said anything. Finally, Dave broke the silence. "Tell me you saw that too," he said, his voice shaky. "I saw it," Mark replied. "What the hell was that?" They both looked at me like I was supposed to have an answer. "I've spent most of my life on these waters. I know every animal that lives in this region, but this wasn't anything I recognized, except maybe from those TV shows about Bigfoot. Down here in Florida, people call them skunk apes. But I'd always thought those were just stories. I don't know," was all I could manage to say. Dave wanted to go closer to where it disappeared, but something in my gut told me that was a bad idea. That grunt growl wasn't an invitation. Besides, the mangroves there are nearly impenetrable. A tangled mess of roots and branches that would be hell to navigate, even if you knew there wasn't a 7-foot creature possibly waiting for you. I suggested we move on to another spot, and thankfully they agreed. We fished for another few hours, but nobody's heart was in it anymore. We kept scanning the shoreline, jumping at every splash or movement in the mangroves. When we got back to the marina, we sat in my truck with the AC running and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Dave had been a pilot for 35 years, flying all over the world. Mark had been a lawyer for just as long, a profession built on skepticism and evidence. These weren't the kind of guys who'd make up stories or be easily fooled. "I've never believed in this stuff," Mark said, "but I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a person in a suit." Dave nodded. The proportions were all wrong for a human. No costume could give someone shoulders that wide or make their chest protrude like that, and the way it moved through those mangroves, that was no costume. I asked if they wanted to report it to anyone, but we all kind of looked at each other and knew the answer. Who would we even tell? The Wildlife Commission, the sheriff? They'd think we were nuts or that we'd been drinking on the water. Mark summed it up. Nobody would believe us anyway. We agreed to keep it between ourselves. They still had another day booked with me, and we decided to fish a completely different area the next day. I don't think any of us wanted to go back to that spot. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head. I've guided thousands of trips over the years. I've seen manatees, dolphins, sharks, rays, alligators, and every kind of bird you can imagine. I know what a bear looks like in the water and on land. I know what wild hogs look like from every angle. This wasn't any of those things. I started researching Florida skunk ape sightings online, and there have been dozens reported in areas not far from where we were. Many described the same reddish-brown hair, the same massive build, the same surprisingly stealthy movement. Some reports even mentioned finding footprints over 16 inches long in mud or sand. The next morning, I picked up Dave and Mark before sunrise. We didn't talk much about what happened the day before, but there was this unspoken tension. We fished a completely different area, caught some nice fish, and had a good time. But I could tell none of us had really slept well. Before they left, Dave pulled me aside. "I've flown over some of the most remote places on Earth," he said. "The Amazon, Siberia, Central Africa. I've always thought there were things out there we haven't discovered yet. I just never expected to find one here in Florida. It's been over a year now, and I've never seen that creature again, though I've looked every time I pass that stretch of shoreline. I pole the boat a little quieter now, scan the edges of the mangroves more carefully. Sometimes I'll cut the motor and just drift, watching and listening. I still guide that area. It's too good a fishing spot to avoid. But I never tell my clients what we saw. Sometimes when we're drifting along those mangroves, I'll catch myself staring into the tangled mess of roots and branches, wondering if it's in there, watching us. I've been on the water almost every day for 20 years. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the wildlife around Crystal River. But now I'm not so sure. There's something else out there. Something that's managed to stay hidden despite thousands of boats passing by every year. When people ask me about the strangest thing I've ever seen on the water, I make up something about a giant bull shark or an alligator attacking a deer. I don't tell them about May 17th, 2022. I don't tell them about the creature with the reddish-brown hair and shoulders 4 feet wide. I don't tell them about the grunt growl that I sometimes still hear in my dreams. Because the truth is, I still can't explain what we saw, and that's what scares me the most. Story 14. I still get goosebumps thinking about that day in October 1979. It's been over 40 years, but I remember it like it happened yesterday, the way the air felt, the silence of the woods, and those things watching us. Let me back up a bit. My name's Andrew, and my brothers Bobby and Jimmy and our buddy John had just moved from Oklahoma City to this tiny place called Drain, Oregon that August. Talk about culture shock. Oklahoma's got its woods and all, but Oregon was something else entirely, these massive, dense forests that seemed to go on forever. By October, we were finally getting settled in our new place. I'd always been into hunting back home, so I was itching to try my luck with some Oregon deer. My brother Jimmy had actually lived in the area before, so he knew some good hunting spots. He suggested this place outside a little town called Yoncalla, about 20 minutes south of where we were staying. So on this particular morning, I'm pretty sure it was a Saturday, we loaded up my old Ford pickup with our gear. Just basic stuff, our rifles, some snacks, thermoses of coffee. It was cold that morning, maybe low 40s, and this mist was hanging between the trees as we drove. I remember wearing my red and black flannel jacket, the one with the tear on the right sleeve, that my ex-girlfriend had tried to patch up. We headed south on Highway 99 from Yoncalla. Then Jimmy directed me to turn west onto this old logging road. It wasn't much more than a dirt path, really, and my truck was bouncing all over the place. The trees were so thick on either side that branches were scraping against the windows. After about 2 miles of this, we came to a fork in the road. Jimmy pointed to the right fork and said, "That one goes up to the top of this mountain." Then he gestured to the left and said, "And that one looks like it goes over to that mountain there." I could see another mountain peak through a gap in the trees across this wooded ravine from where we were. We decided to take the right fork. The road got even rougher as we climbed, and I was worried about bottoming out my truck on the rocks. Eventually, we reached a small clearing near the top where I could turn the truck around, so we parked there. The view was pretty impressive. You could see across this deep ravine to the neighboring mountain, maybe 300 to 500 yards away. We got out and started getting our gear together, talking about which direction we should head. That's when Jimmy suddenly went quiet. I looked over at him, and he was staring intently across the ravine. "You see that?" he asked, pointing. At first, I didn't see anything except trees. "See what?" "There's something moving over there." I squinted, scanning the tree line on the opposite ridge. The morning sun was at an angle that made it hard to see clearly. Then I caught it. Movement between the trees. Something big and dark. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Even though there was no way anything could hear us from that distance, we both stood there, frozen, watching as this thing moved through the trees. It was walking upright like a man, but bigger. Much bigger. It moved with this strange, fluid grace that didn't seem right for something so large. It walked right up to the edge of the ridge on the opposite mountain, where there was a small clearing similar to ours. And then it just stopped. Standing there at the edge, partially obscured by a few trees, but clearly visible enough. I couldn't make out facial features at that distance, but I could see the outline clearly. It was massive. A huge, broad-shouldered figure covered in what looked like black fur. It stood there for maybe 15 or 20 seconds, completely still, just looking. I don't know if it was looking at us specifically, but it felt like it was. My mouth had gone completely dry. I remember my hand instinctively reaching for my rifle, but Jimmy grabbed my arm. "Don't," he whispered. The creature then turned and walked back into the trees, but it didn't disappear completely. About 20 feet back from the edge, it stopped and turned again, facing directly toward us. Now it was partially hidden by the trees, but I could still make out its silhouette. It stood there, watching, for what felt like forever, but was probably about half a minute. That's when I noticed the second one. A smaller figure appeared next to the big one, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, where the first one had to be at least 6.5, possibly 7 feet. The smaller one seemed to move more nervously, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. "Jesus Christ," Jimmy breathed. "There's a kid." And that's exactly what it looked like, a parent and child. They both stood there perfectly still, except for the smaller ones fidgeting, just watching us. I had this overwhelming feeling of being studied, like we were the animals in a zoo. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After what felt like ages, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, they both slowly turned and disappeared over the ridge. Not running, not hurrying, just calmly walking away. We stood there in stunned silence for a long time. My legs felt weak, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. "What the fuck was that?" I finally managed to say. Jimmy just shook his head. "You know what that was." And I did. I didn't want to say it out loud. It seemed ridiculous, but I knew. We'd just seen Bigfoot, and not just one, but 2 of them. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was other hunters, but no hunter is 7 feet tall and covered in black fur. Bears standing on their hind legs. But these things walked upright naturally, with a gait that was eerily human-like, yet different. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, too. Long arms, relatively small head on broad shoulders. The big one had to be at least 300 pounds, maybe 400, but it didn't move like something that heavy should move. It was fluid, almost graceful, and the smaller one, it couldn't have been more than 100 pounds or so, but moved the same way. We decided to get the hell out of there. Neither of us felt much like hunting anymore. As we drove back down the mountain, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. The woods that had seemed so beautiful earlier now felt threatening, like they were hiding secrets. When we reached the fork in the road, we saw a man on horseback. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a grey beard. He had a rifle in a scabbard attached to his saddle. We stopped the truck, and I rolled down my window. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you noticed anything unusual around here today?" The man just stared at me for a moment, his expression completely unreadable. Then, without saying a word, he reached down and pulled out this massive revolver from a holster I hadn't noticed before. He didn't point it at us or anything, just held it casually in his hand. "I'm not worried about it," he said, his voice flat. That was it. Just those 5 words. Then he clicked to his horse and rode off down the left fork, the one that led toward where we'd seen the creatures. Jimmy and I exchanged looks. "What the hell was that about?" I asked. "I think he knows," Jimmy said quietly. "I think he knows exactly what's out here." We drove back to Yoncalla in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we got there, we stopped at the general store. There were a few locals inside, and I thought maybe we should tell someone what we'd seen. So I approached the counter where this middle-aged woman was working. "Excuse me," I said, "but we just saw something really strange up in the woods, near that old logging road west of town." The woman's expression changed immediately, not to one of interest or concern, but to something cold and closed off. "Is that right?" she said, not looking at me anymore as she busied herself arranging items behind the counter. "Yeah, it looked like—" I hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish. "Well, it looked like a Bigfoot. 2 of them, actually." The store got very quiet. There were 3 or 4 other customers, and they all either looked away or suddenly became very interested in whatever they were buying. "Lot of strange things in those woods," the woman finally said. "Shadows play tricks on you." But the way she said it, it wasn't dismissive like she thought we were crazy. It was more like a warning, like she was telling us to drop it. I noticed an older man in the corner eyeing us. He was wearing overalls and a flannel shirt, chewing on a toothpick. "You boys aren't from around here, are you?" he asked. "No, sir," I replied. "Just moved up from Oklahoma." He nodded slowly. "Well, welcome to Oregon. Word of advice. Some things in these woods, best left alone, best not even talked about." Then he paid for his groceries and left. The woman at the counter wouldn't meet my eyes after that. She rang up the sodas we'd grabbed and practically pushed our change across the counter, clearly wanting us gone. As we drove home, Jimmy said something that still haunts me. "They all know," he said. "Everyone in that town knows about those things in the woods. They've made some kind of peace with it. They don't talk about it. They don't acknowledge it. They just leave it be." We never went back to that spot again, never went hunting anywhere near Yoncalla either. But sometimes at night, I still dream about those 2 figures standing on that ridge, watching us. I dream about what might have happened if we'd taken the left fork instead of the right, or what happened to that old man with the revolver. I don't tell many people this story. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But I know what I saw that day, and I know those people in Yoncalla knew more than they were saying. There are things in those Oregon woods that aren't supposed to exist, but they do. And the locals have figured out how to live with that knowledge. I haven't, 40+ years later, and I still haven't. Story 15, and I don't usually share this kind of thing online, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. What happened to me in October of 2009 still gives me nightmares. I've always been an outdoorsman, hunting, fishing, camping since I was a kid. Nothing ever scared me in the woods until that month. I had planned a 36-day stay at my favorite spot in the backcountry. It's about 20 miles from the nearest town, deep in national forest land. I've been going there for years. It's where I can truly disconnect and recharge. I set up my camp trailer, a 24-foot Salem that weighs about 5,000 pounds. Not some flimsy pop-up. This is a solid trailer with stabilizer jacks at all 4 corners to keep it from rocking. My buddies were supposed to join me later in the month when hunting season opened, but I went up early to enjoy some solitude. During the days, I'd ride my ATV on the old logging roads, scout for game, or just sit by the fire with a beer and a book. Perfect peace, you know? The kind of quiet you can't find anywhere else. The first few nights were amazing, clear skies full of stars, the kind of silence you can almost hear. I slept better there than I ever did at home, until October 5th. I woke up at 12:24 a.m. I remember checking my watch because something felt off. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized my entire trailer was shaking, not gentle swaying from wind. This was violent rocking, back and forth, like someone was grabbing the frame and deliberately trying to tip it over. My first thought was bear. We get black bears in the area and occasionally a grizzly passes through. I've had bears investigate my camp before, but they usually just sniff around looking for food. This was different. The whole damn trailer was moving several inches side to side. The stabilizers were creaking under the strain. I grabbed my Remington 870 shotgun from beside the bed and tried to look out the windows, but it was pitch black outside. I couldn't see a thing beyond the small clearing where I was parked. "Hey, get out of here!" I shouted, thinking my voice might scare off whatever it was. The rocking got worse. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I fumbled for the air horn I keep for emergencies and pressed the button. The blast was deafening inside the trailer, but the rocking didn't stop. If anything, it got more aggressive. I was genuinely scared now. Bears don't ignore air horns. They run. I grabbed my truck keys and hit the panic button. My pickup was parked about 15 feet from the trailer, and the alarm started blaring, lights flashing in the darkness. The rocking finally stopped after about 20 seconds of the horn blaring. I stood in the middle of my trailer, shotgun ready, listening to the silence that followed. When my truck alarm finally shut off, the woods were completely quiet. No insects, no nightbirds, nothing. It was that unnatural silence that hunters recognize as a warning sign. Something was still out there. I was too terrified to go outside, so I sat on my bed, gun in hand, waiting. After maybe 10 minutes of absolute silence, I heard it. From the ridge about 200 yards behind my trailer came a sound I still can't properly describe. It started as a high-pitched whistle, almost like someone signaling. Then it transformed into something like a horse's whinny, but wrong somehow. Too modulated, too controlled. And then it ended with this deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the air. The whole vocalization lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds. I've spent my entire life in the outdoors. I've heard every animal in these mountains. Elk, moose, bears, cougars, coyotes. This wasn't any of them, not even close. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I sat with my shotgun, a spotlight, and a thermos of coffee, watching the windows. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When dawn finally came, I grabbed my gun and cautiously stepped outside. The morning was crisp and clear, completely normal. Birds were singing. It felt surreal after the terror of the night. I spent 2 hours searching the area around my trailer for tracks or evidence. The ground was mostly pine needles and some patchy grass, not great for tracking. I found nothing. No footprints, no fur, no disturbed vegetation. Whatever had nearly rocked my trailer off its stabilizers hadn't left a trace. I called my buddy Mark, who was planning to join me in a week. I tried to explain what happened without sounding crazy. "Probably just a bear, Mike," he said. "Maybe it was scratching its back on the trailer." "No way," I told him. "You don't understand how violent this was, and bears don't make sounds like what I heard." He laughed it off, but promised to come up that weekend instead of waiting another week. I was grateful. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared to be alone out there. When Mark arrived on Friday, I showed him how stable my trailer was. The Salem has heavy-duty stabilizer jacks that lock it firmly in place. When properly deployed, the trailer doesn't move, even when you walk around inside. "Try to rock it," I challenged him. Mark is a big guy, 6'3", 220 pounds of mostly muscle. He grabbed the frame and pushed with everything he had. The trailer barely moved an inch. Now imagine something rocking it so hard The whole thing was moving 4 or 5 inches each way, I said. Something that didn't care about an air horn or truck alarm until it decided to leave. I could see the skepticism fade from his face. What the hell could do that? He asked. I don't know, I replied. But it's out there. That night, we kept a fire going later than usual. We both had our rifles nearby, trying to act normal while constantly scanning the darkness beyond our camp. Around 11, we heard something moving in the brush about 50 yards away. Heavy footsteps, snapping branches. Mark shined his spotlight in that direction, but we saw nothing. Probably an elk, he said, but his voice was tense. We went to bed around midnight, Mark in his tent, me back in the trailer. I dozed fitfully until about 2 in the morning, when I was awakened by Mark frantically zipping open his tent. Did you hear that? He whispered harshly, standing outside my trailer door with his rifle. Hear what? That scream from the ridge. Jesus Christ, Mike. It was exactly what you described. My blood ran cold. You believe me now? He nodded, his face pale, even in the darkness. What the fuck is out there? We spent the rest of the night on alert, but nothing else happened. In the morning, Mark was unusually quiet. After breakfast, he packed up his tent. Look, I'm not proud of this, but I can't stay, he said. There's something not right about these woods. I wanted to be angry, but honestly, part of me wanted to leave too. Still, I'd planned this trip for months, and I'm stubborn. I decided to stay. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. I kept feeling like I was being watched. I'd be sitting by my fire, and the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. I'd turn around, shine my light into the trees, and see nothing. On October 13th, my other friend Dave arrived for a few days of hunting. I told him what had happened, expecting the same initial disbelief I'd gotten from Mark. But Dave surprised me. I believe you, he said immediately. My cousin works for the Forest Service over in Idaho. They've had reports of something similar. We spent 2 uneventful days hunting. On the 3rd day, Dave went up to the North Ridge while I stayed near camp. Around dusk, he came crashing through the underbrush, out of breath and wide-eyed. We need to go into town now, he insisted. What happened? I asked, alarmed by his state. I was walking along that old logging road on the ridge when I heard something following me in the trees, he explained. At first I thought it was a bear, but it was pacing me, staying just out of sight. Then it started making this sound, like nothing I've ever heard. I took off running and it followed me all the way down the mountain. We drove into town that night and stayed at the local motel. Dave left the next morning, said he couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked. I almost gave up then, but I'd already paid for my campsite for the whole month. Plus, I had more friends scheduled to arrive for the main hunting season opening. I went back, telling myself I was being ridiculous. For the next few days, things were calm. Then the tapping started. It would always happen around 2 or 3 in the morning. Light, deliberate tapping on the aluminum sides of my trailer. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Moving around the trailer's perimeter. I'd grab my shotgun and spotlight, throw open the door, and find nothing. No tracks, no animals, nothing that could explain it. The closest other campers were over a mile away. When my neighbor Tom from the next campsite over came by for coffee one morning, I casually asked if he'd heard anything strange at night. His expression changed immediately. You too, huh? He told me that 3 nights earlier, he'd stepped outside his RV to take a leak around midnight and spotted what he described as a huge, dark figure moving toward his camp from the tree line. He shined his flashlight at it, and it simply vanished into the trees. No sound, just gone. It was at least 7 feet tall, Mike, too big for a bear, especially moving on 2 legs like that. By this point, 5 different people had experienced something strange on this mountain. Mark heard the vocalization. Dave was chased. Tom saw something huge, and 2 other hunting buddies who'd stayed briefly reported being uncomfortable enough that they left early, describing an oppressive feeling of being watched. On my 30th day there, I'd had enough. The tapping had happened 3 nights in a row, despite me setting up motion-activated floodlights around my trailer. Whatever this thing was, it was smart enough to avoid the sensors. I was packing up when I found the prints. They were in a muddy patch behind my trailer that had formed after a rain shower the night before. I almost missed them because they weren't where I'd been looking all this time. They were humanoid, but huge. Easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between prints was over 4 feet. I took pictures, but honestly they don't show much. Just vague depressions that could be dismissed as anything. But I know what I saw. I've spent 13 years trying to make sense of what happened during those weeks in the woods. I've read about Bigfoot encounters, talked to other outdoorsmen, even contacted researchers. Some of the details match known Sasquatch behavior. The wood knocking, my tapping, the strange vocalizations, the feeling of being watched. But nothing explains the strength it would take to rock my heavy trailer like that, or why it seemed to be testing me, observing my reactions. I still go camping and hunting, but never alone now, and never in that part of the forest. Whatever's out there, it knows the woods better than I ever will, and it was watching me the entire time. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I wake up and don't believe it myself. Then I remember that sound from the ridge and the violent rocking of my trailer, and I know there are things in the wilderness that we still don't understand, and sometimes they understand us better than we think. Story 16. I've debated posting this for years. Every time I think about that August evening in 2007, my hands start shaking. Even now, typing this out, I can feel my heart racing, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. I live near Red Deer, Alberta, in a house that sits right at the edge of a large cornfield. Behind that field is a thick mix of spruce and poplar trees that stretches for miles. It's beautiful country, isolated enough to feel peaceful but not so remote that you feel completely cut off. At least, that's how I used to feel about it. My sister Jenny was visiting with her kids, my niece Emma, 7, and nephew Tyler, 5. They lived in Calgary then and would come up every few months. The kids loved my place because of all the open space to run around, so different from their city apartment. It was a perfect summer evening, warm but not hot, with that golden light you get in Alberta during late summer. We'd had a barbecue earlier, and as the sun started to set around 8:30 or so, I suggested we have a marshmallow roast in the backyard. The kids went nuts for the idea, of course. I have this small fire pit about 20 yards from my back door. We got it going while Jenny helped the kids find sticks for their marshmallows. I remember being in such a good mood, watching Emma and Tyler run around the yard, their faces lit up with excitement. They kept venturing closer to the cornfield, playing some made-up game of tag where the field edge was base. I was turning the logs in the fire when I first noticed something odd. There was movement in the corn, about 25 yards in from where the kids were playing. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there wasn't any breeze that evening. The stalks were being pushed aside in a deliberate way, like something was moving through them. "Hey kids, stay a bit closer to the fire," I called out, trying to sound casual. They ignored me, of course. That's when I saw it. A dark figure rose up from behind the corn stalks. At first I could only see the top of its head, rounded and covered in what looked like dark brown hair. Then it stood taller, its shoulders well above the corn, which was at least 7 feet high at that point in the season. I froze. My marshmallow stick slipped from my fingers. The thing, because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing as anything else at that moment, was just standing there, completely still, watching the children play. Through gaps in the corn, I could make out parts of its face. It had grayish skin with a rough texture, like weathered leather. Its eyes were deep set under a prominent brow ridge. I could see a wide mouth and what looked like a flat, broad nose. I've never felt fear like that before. It wasn't panic. It was something deeper, more primal. Every instinct in my body was screaming danger, but I knew I couldn't freak out, or the kids might run in the wrong direction. "Jenny," I said quietly, "can you call the kids over? Don't look toward the field." My sister must have heard something in my voice because she didn't question me. "Emma, Tyler, come help Aunt Laura with the marshmallows," she called, her voice remarkably steady. The creature didn't move. It just watched. When the kids reached us, I casually suggested we take our marshmallows inside and watch a movie. "It's getting a bit chilly," I lied. Tyler complained a little, but Emma, always the more perceptive one, looked at my face and went quiet. As we walked toward the house, I positioned myself between the kids and the cornfield. I didn't look back until we reached the door. When I did, the figure was still there, just watching us. Once inside, I locked the door and closed all the blinds, except for the kitchen window that faced the backyard. Jenny started asking questions, but I just nodded toward the window. We stood there, peering out through a small gap in the curtains. That's when we got a better look at it, as it moved to the edge of the cornfield. God, it was massive. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with shoulders twice as broad as mine. Its chest was wide and powerful looking, and its arms, Jesus, its arms hung down almost to its knees. The body was covered in the same dark brown hair I'd seen on its head, but it wasn't like fur exactly, more like very thick, coarse human hair. "What the hell is that?" Jenny whispered, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the thing did something I'll never forget as long as I live. It threw its head back and let out a scream that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside it. The sound was unlike anything I've ever heard. Part roar, part howl, but unmistakably a warning. It was so powerful it actually made my windows rattle. I swear I felt it in my chest, like standing too close to the speakers at a concert. The kids started crying immediately. Tyler buried his face in his mom's side, while Emma just stood there, tears streaming down her face, too scared to even make a sound. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. This can't be happening. But it was. After that scream, the creature backed into the corn again. We couldn't see it anymore, but I knew it was still out there. We huddled in the living room, away from the windows, with all the lights on. Nobody talked about what we'd seen, not directly. Jenny just kept saying things like, "It's okay, and we're safe in here," to the kids. I put on a DVD for the kids, some animated movie, but none of us were watching it. My eyes kept darting to the windows, even though the blinds were closed. Every creak of the house, every small noise outside made me jump. Jenny and I exchanged looks throughout the evening, but somehow we never found the words to discuss what we'd seen. The kids eventually fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from fear. Jenny and I stayed up, taking turns keeping watch, though what we would have done if that thing decided to come to the house, I have no idea. Around 2 in the morning, when it was my turn to stay awake, I heard movement in the corn again, that distinctive sound of stalks being pushed aside. I didn't look out. I couldn't bring myself to. I just sat there, back against the wall, holding my breath, praying it wouldn't come any closer. By morning, there was no sign of the creature. The kids were subdued at breakfast, but kids are resilient. By midday, they were playing inside as if nothing had happened, though they didn't ask to go outside again. Jenny packed up their stuff right after lunch. "I think we'll head back early," she said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't try to convince them to stay. After they left, I forced myself to go out to the cornfield. I needed to know if what I'd seen was real or if I'd somehow hallucinated the whole thing. The evidence was there, clear as day. About 25 yards in, right where I'd seen the figure standing, there was a large area of flattened corn. The stalks weren't just bent, some were broken completely, snapped by something heavy. I found more areas like this, creating a path through my field toward the forest edge. The most disturbing thing I found was a footprint in a muddy patch near the tree line. It was huge, at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. It had 5 toes like a human foot, but the proportions were all wrong. I took a picture of it with my phone, but when I got back to the house and looked at it, the image was too shadowy to make out clearly. I've spent countless hours since then researching what I saw. I know now it was a Sasquatch, what some people call Bigfoot. Everything matches the descriptions I've read. The height, the body shape, the deep-set eyes, the scream that people describe as bone-chilling. The strangest part of all this is that Jenny and I have never discussed what happened that night, not once in all these years. It's like we both silently agreed that acknowledging it would make it too real. When the kids mention that trip, they only talk about the marshmallows and the movie. Maybe their minds have protected them by blocking out the rest. I still live in the same house. I've thought about moving many times, but this is my home. I've never seen the creature again, though sometimes, when I'm out on my porch at night, I get the feeling I'm being watched from the tree line. I've never reported this officially. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That scream. I still hear it in my nightmares. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced it's just sounded again. I don't go near the cornfield after dark anymore, and every August, when the corn grows tall, I find myself keeping the blinds closed a little more often, jumping at unexpected sounds and wondering if it's still out there, watching and waiting. Story 17. I've never told this story publicly before. I'm still not entirely sure what I saw that night, but it's been 13 years, and I still think about it constantly. My husband Jason thinks I should just let it go, but I can't. What happened in those Vermont woods changed me forever. It was mid-July 2010. Jason and I had been married for about 3 years, and we were both pretty burnt out from work. We decided to take a weekend camping trip to get away from everything. Nothing fancy, just the two of us, a tent, and some peace and quiet. We chose the mountains near Groton, Vermont. Jason had been there once before with college friends and remembered it being beautiful and secluded. We wanted to avoid the designated campgrounds full of families and RVs, so we drove down these winding back roads until we found a dirt path that looked promising. We followed it for maybe 2 miles in our pickup until it got too narrow, then parked and hiked in with our gear. The spot we found was perfect. A small clearing near a creek that bubbled over smooth rocks. Tall pines surrounded us on all sides, and the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches. It was exactly what we needed. No cell service, no other people, just nature. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and Jason got a nice fire going while I unpacked our cooler. We grilled some burgers over the fire, drank a couple beers, and just talked. No work talk, no bills talk, just remembering funny stories from when we first met and planning future trips we wanted to take. The sky turned this incredible deep blue as the sun set, and the stars were unbelievable, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. Around 10 o'clock, I needed to use the bathroom. In the wilderness, that means finding a private spot away from camp. I grabbed our flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that's practically a weapon, and told Jason I'd be right back. I walked down the narrow trail that led away from our campsite, wanting to get far enough away for privacy, but not so far that I'd get lost. I'd gone maybe 75 to 100 feet when something changed. The air felt different somehow. The forest had been alive with night sounds, crickets, frogs from the creek, the occasional rustle of small animals, but everything went completely silent. And then I smelled it. It's hard to describe that smell even now. Damp, musky, like wet dog mixed with something rotten, but also, I don't know, almost human-like really bad body odor, but wilder. The smell hit me so suddenly that I actually stopped walking. That's when I felt it, this overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? It was like that, but 1,000 times stronger. Every hair on my body stood up. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the trees ahead of me, and there it was. standing completely still between two massive pine trees, maybe 25 feet away from me. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was massive, standing upright on two legs, covered in thick, dark, reddish-brown hair. Not fur like a bear, actual hair, longer in some places than others. Its body was incredibly broad, with shoulders that seemed twice the width of a normal man's. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably more. What struck me as weird was that it didn't really have a neck. Its head just sat low on those massive shoulders, and its arms, God, its arms hung down almost to its knees, but it was the eyes that really got me. When my flashlight beam hit them, they reflected back this yellowish amber color. Not like a deer's eyes that shine bright white. These were different, and they were looking right at me, not with animal curiosity, but with intelligence, awareness. I completely froze. I couldn't scream, I couldn't run. I just stood there staring at this impossible thing, and it stared right back at me. It didn't make any aggressive moves. It didn't make any sound at all. It just watched me, its chest rising and falling with deep breaths. I don't know how long we stood there looking at each other. Probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then my body finally responded, and I dropped the flashlight. The heavy metal clanked against a rock, and the beam pointed off into the trees. That sound broke whatever spell I was under, and I ran. I fucking ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I was gasping for breath by the time I got back to our campsite. Jason was sitting by the fire, and he jumped up when he saw me. I must have looked terrified because his face immediately filled with concern. "Amber, what happened? Are you okay?" he asked, grabbing my shoulders. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I couldn't get the words out between gulps of air. Something big, standing, watching me, I managed to say. Jason looked past me down the trail, and his face changed. "Where's the flashlight?" he asked. That's when I realized I'd left it behind. Through my panic, I turned and pointed back toward the trail. I dropped it when I saw the thing. We both looked back down the trail, and from our campsite, we could see a faint glow where my flashlight was still shining among the trees. Jason grabbed his pocket knife, as if that would do anything, and we stood there, staring at that distant light. Then something happened that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The light moved. It shifted position, tilted upward, and then began to rise and move through the trees. The beam swung around, illuminating branches and trunks as it went. The creature had picked up the flashlight. It wasn't just carrying it, it was using it. The beam moved methodically, like someone searching the area. Then it pointed directly at us for a brief second, before turning away and moving deeper into the forest, the light gradually fading as it went. "We need to go." "Now," I whispered, already backing toward our truck. Jason didn't argue. We didn't even properly pack up. We stuffed our sleeping bags into their sacks without rolling them, threw our cooler into the tent, and barely collapsed the tent enough to drag it behind us. We grabbed the essentials, car keys, wallets, phones, and practically ran back to the truck. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that creature following us, maybe with my flashlight still in its hand. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be moving. Every snap of a twig sounded like footsteps. I've never been so terrified in my life. We reached the truck, threw our stuff in the back, and Jason fumbled with the keys, dropping them once, before finally getting the door unlocked. We jumped in, and he started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as we turned around and sped back down that dirt path, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. Neither of us spoke until we reached the paved road. Jason was white-knuckling the steering wheel, and I was still shaking. "What the hell was that, Amber?" he finally asked, not taking his eyes off the road. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was too big, too real. You think it was a..." He couldn't even say it. "A Bigfoot? I don't know what else it could have been." We drove all the way to the highway without stopping, both of us jumping at every shadow that crossed the road. Jason hadn't seen the creature directly, but he'd seen the flashlight move. He believed me, which was something at least. What bothered me most, what still bothers me, wasn't just seeing this impossible creature. It was how it behaved. It didn't charge at me or roar. It didn't run away either. It just stood there, watching me. And then it picked up my flashlight. Picked it up and used it like a person would. That's not animal behavior. That's something else entirely. We left behind probably $300 worth of camping gear that night. The tent, our cooking stuff, even my favorite camping pillow, but there was no way in hell we were going back for it. We never reported what happened. Who would we tell? The local police. Excuse me, officer, but I think I saw Bigfoot and it stole my flashlight. They'd think we were drunk or high or just making up stories. But I know what I saw. I remember every detail. The way its hair moved slightly in the breeze, the steam of its breath in the cool night air, those intelligent eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Sometimes I dream about it, standing there watching me, and I wake up in a cold sweat. Jason and I still go camping, but never in that part of Vermont again. We stick to established campgrounds now, places with other people nearby, places where the scariest thing you might encounter is a raccoon trying to steal your marshmallows. I've spent years reading about other people's experiences, trying to make sense of what happened. Some stories sound similar to mine. The same height description, the same reddish-brown hair, the same uncanny intelligence. It helps knowing I'm not alone, that other people have seen something they can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there. That creature may be still carrying my flashlight. Does it understand what the object is? Did it keep it as a tool or a trophy? I'll never know. What I do know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows of our understanding. I never believed in any of this stuff before that night. Now, I'm not so sure what to believe anymore. Story 18. I've never told this story in a public forum before. For years, I've kept it to myself, only sharing it with my husband and eventually my kids when they were old enough. But it's time to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. This happened 23 years ago when I was 12. My family had this tradition of camping at Huntsville State Park in Texas every summer. It was always the highlight of my year, swimming, hiking, making s'mores around the campfire. This particular year, my 7-year-old nephew Jake was staying with us for the summer, while my sister was going through a rough divorce. Jake was this wild little kid with an endless supply of energy, always wanting to explore. About 3 days into our trip, he wouldn't stop talking about this super-secret fishing spot he'd found the day before while exploring with my dad. He kept going on about how they'd seen huge fish jumping there, and he was desperate to go back. So on Thursday morning, I agreed to take him. My parents were setting up for a big family cookout later that day, and I figured it would keep Jake out of their hair for a few hours. We packed our fishing gear, some sandwiches and water bottles into this old aluminum rowboat my dad had rented. The lake at Huntsville isn't massive, but it's decent sized, with all these little coves and inlets surrounded by pine trees. The water that day was this murky greenish brown, normal for East Texas lakes. It was hot, probably around 90 degrees, with that heavy humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. I remember how the metal seat of the boat was already burning hot at 9 in the morning. Jake insisted on rowing at first, which meant we zigzagged all over the place while he splashed water everywhere. After about 15 minutes, I took over and he directed me toward this little cove on the opposite side of the lake. It was farther than I expected, tucked behind a small peninsula covered in pine trees. "It's right past those tall trees," Jake kept saying, pointing to a section of shoreline that looked exactly like every other part to me. The fishing spot turned out to be this shallow inlet where a small creek fed into the lake. It was pretty secluded, with trees hanging low over the water, creating patches of shade. Jake was right about one thing. You could see fish swimming in the clear water where the creek entered the lake. We anchored the boat, just a brick tied to a rope, about 30 feet from shore, and started fishing. It was peaceful at first, just the sounds of cicadas buzzing, occasional splashes from fish jumping, and Jake's non-stop chatter about what lures to use. I remember checking my watch around 11:30, thinking we should head back soon for lunch, when everything changed. It started with the birds. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch, dozens of birds exploded from the trees along the shoreline. Not just a few, I mean hundreds of them, all at once. Sparrows, jays, crows, all bursting out of the trees in this chaotic cloud. The noise was incredible, this frantic flapping and squawking that echoed across the water. Jake was like, "Whoa, cool!" But something about it made my stomach drop. Animals don't do that without a reason. That's when I saw it. At first I thought someone was walking along the shoreline about 100 yards to our right, but as I focused, I realized whatever it was wasn't walking normally. It was moving fast with these long, powerful strides, and it was huge. I can still see it perfectly when I close my eyes. It was tall, way taller than any man I'd ever seen. 7 feet at minimum, maybe closer to 8. It was covered in this dark, almost black fur that looked matted in places. The fur on its head was longer, like a shaggy mane of deep brown hair. But its face, God, its face. It wasn't like an ape exactly, but definitely not human either. The face was this brownish color, with a prominent brow and a wide, flat nose. Its arms were massive, swinging as it ran, and I could see the muscles moving under the fur. The thing that has haunted me most all these years were its eyes. They weren't the eyes of some mindless animal. They were filled with what I can only describe as fear, real, human-like fear. It kept looking back over its shoulder as it ran, like it was being chased by something, and for a brief moment, it looked directly at us. In that split second when our eyes met, I felt this jolt of recognition. Not that I knew this creature, but that there was an intelligence behind those eyes. Something that understood fear the same way I did. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before it disappeared into the tree line, crashing through the underbrush. But those seconds have replayed in my mind thousands of times over the years. I dropped my fishing rod and started pulling up the anchor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the rope. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Jake, not wanting to make noise in case it came back. Jake was staring at the shoreline with his mouth hanging open. "Yeah, did you see the others? They were splashing in the water." My blood went cold. "Others? What others?" "The other monsters. There were more of them down by the water." To this day, I don't know if Jake actually saw more of these creatures or if he was just being a kid, embellishing what we'd seen. He seemed more excited than scared, bouncing in his seat and pointing toward where it had disappeared. I started rowing as hard as I could, not even caring which direction we went as long as it was away from that shoreline. My arms were burning and sweat was dripping into my eyes, but all I could think about was getting back to our campsite. Jake kept chattering, asking if we could come back tomorrow to see more monsters, completely oblivious to how terrified I was. I must have snapped at him to be quiet because I remember him looking hurt and confused. The worst part was that in my panic, I got completely turned around. The lake wasn't that big, but all the shorelines looked the same with the pine trees and underbrush. I couldn't find the boat dock where we'd launched from. After about 20 minutes of frantic rowing, I spotted a clearing that looked like a campsite and headed straight for it. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't our campsite. There was a different family there, a couple with a young daughter roasting hot dogs. They looked startled when I practically crashed the boat onto their shore. The man came over, probably thinking we were in some kind of trouble. "You kids okay? This isn't a boat launch." I opened my mouth to apologize, but no words came out. Instead, I burst into tears, not just a few quiet tears, but full-on sobbing, the kind where you can't catch your breath. All the terror I'd been holding in just poured out. The worst part was that from where we'd landed, I could see across the lake to where we'd been fishing. The very thought of looking in that direction made me start hyperventilating. "I don't want to go back," I kept saying between sobs. "Please, I don't want to go back over there." The couple was really nice. The woman sat with me while I calmed down, and the man called the park rangers on their portable radio. He told them where we were and that we needed help getting back to our campsite. I was too embarrassed and scared to tell them what I'd seen, so I just mumbled something about getting lost and scared. When the ranger came in his boat to pick us up, Jake finally seemed to realize how upset I was and kept quiet about what we'd seen. The ranger probably thought I was just a dramatic preteen who'd gotten spooked by being lost. When we got back to our campsite, my parents were frantic. They'd been about to call the rangers themselves when they got word we'd been found. My mum hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and I started crying all over again. I didn't tell my parents what happened that day. I was scared they wouldn't believe me, or, worse, that they'd think something was wrong with me. Jake tried to bring it up at dinner that night, talking about the big, hairy monsters we saw, but everyone just laughed and assumed he was making up stories like he always did. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves outside our tent made my heart race. I kept imagining those eyes watching me from the darkness. We were supposed to stay 2 more nights, but the next morning I faked being sick, complaining of stomach cramps and nausea until my parents finally agreed to pack up and head home early. For months afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes. I refused to go camping again, making up excuses whenever my family planned a trip. It wasn't until I was in college that I finally told my boyfriend, now husband, about what I'd seen. He didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just listened, and that meant everything. Over the years, I've researched similar sightings in East Texas. There are enough of them to make me certain I'm not crazy. Whatever I saw that day was real. Sometimes I wonder if it was as scared of us as I was of it. The fear in its eyes has stayed with me all these years. I've never been back to Huntsville State Park. I can't bring myself to face that place again. Even now, as a grown woman with children of my own, the memory of that creature running along the shoreline makes my hands shake as I type this. I don't know what it was. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I still see those eyes looking back at me across the water.